Wesley spent about 20 years mastering the art of knife wielding. It cost him many injuries and bloody blisters, but such efforts made him the best professional in his field in the country. The man was considered the best chef, and all the tables in the restaurant were always filled with customers. Today was no exception. The constipation in the kitchen only increased. Busy with his work, Wesley didn't even notice how his phone was ringing off the hook. His colleagues had to draw his attention to this circumstance. Looking at the screen, the man was surprised to see a notification for a game he had deleted a long time ago. But he was not allowed to deal with this matter calmly either. Unexpected guests arrived, and these people were very persistent in their desire to see the boss. It turned out that they were representatives of the mafia, led by the villain Timothy. He had been chasing Wesley for several Sundays now, offering to let him work for him. Such a knife master, from his point of view, was a real treasure. There was, of course, no ceiling on earnings, and as proof of this, the recruiter brought, so to speak, a grateful contribution. 300 million could be a good payment for the first task. But Wesley did not want to connect his life with actions unworthy of his honor. He didn't spend years of his life to be tormented by his conscience and enrich bandits, so the chef politely but firmly asked the visitors to leave the kitchen. This outraged Timothy, who judged all people by his own image. He kept insisting, so Wesley had to resort to his signature weapon. This gesture immediately made the mafioso sober up. Obviously, the scoundrel recruiter didn't intend to stop this conversation. But today he left. Once the hassle at the restaurant has been dealt with a bit, it's time for a quick rest. The sous chef, who left Wesley for a smoke break, sincerely did not understand why he refused the generous offer. He noted that it was not necessary to kill someone to obtain such a sum. The argument was interrupted again by the sound of a phone notification, and the angry voice of the restaurant owner immediately left Wesley alone with his thoughts. The problem of money in his family was indeed a pressing issue, and the proposed sum was not small. Another notification made the chef reach into his pocket for his phone. It was the same game again, which was strange because the man remembered deleting it from his device. Now he wanted to do the same thing. But I accidentally clicked on a message that opened the game's start page. Wesley heard a soundtrack he liked and began to remember all the benefits of the app. He didn't even notice how he simply hung in place for a while. Suddenly the screen went white, the music disappeared, and the chef thought there was some kind of glitch. But, unexpectedly, the knife master began to quickly dissolve into thin air. A couple of minutes later, the sous chef came out to look for him but found no one at the back exit. Only the white screen of the comrade glowed in the dark alley on the ground. The strange disappearance of the chef must have caused quite a stir in the city. Most likely, the restaurant went bankrupt. But this story is not about cooking at all. A new life awaited Wesley. Now that the man had been in the game for a long time, he didn't understand what exactly attracted him to it. It didn't stand out at all from other competitors in the Play Store. He couldn't explain his desire to download it. Perhaps it was boredom. Sometimes Wesley felt that it was all down to the good portrayal of the female characters. In his venerable years, he spent a lot of money on some application. And, ironically, once inside, he became not even an NPC, let alone a main cast. He was some kind of secondary avatar who was located in an unknown place and was doing an unknown thing. Here, Wesley had the name Russell. This character was a young man. Luckily, the game took place in South Korea, so it wasn't hard to adapt. Of course, the developers made some mistakes, but this could be put up with once you learned the differences. And being a teenager, as opposed to being 50, was a significant advantage. A year later, the man's sense of the unreality of this place had completely disappeared. Besides, he felt much better here than in his previous universe. And everything changed in one day. His parents were already on the doorstep when they informed him that a letter had arrived with his name on it, regarding his enrollment in the academy. Of course, Russell had no idea what was going on. With wide eyes, he went to pack his things as ordered by his mother to go to the entrance ceremony. In fact, he had no idea that even with such an avatar, he would not have a peaceful life. Since, according to them, this was his parents' cherished dream, he could not refuse to enroll. Not even that. His objections were simply not listened to, as if it was not his life. Sitting in his room, Wesley tried to come to terms with what awaited him, and he no longer doubted that this would be some kind of intriguing storyline. Russell passed the entrance exams before the chef's transformation. He had godlike powers. Perhaps this avatar had some extraordinary talent that would need to be dealt with. This power was an achievement of not many people in this world. Special abilities are rare. They said it was part of the genetic code, so it could have been in the blood. According to their talent, people were divided into 3 categories: privileged, middle class, and poor. And the existence of the Joaquin Academy, which Russell joined, served only to maintain status. After all, it was the children of the upper class who mainly had the opportunity to study there. But in order to slightly cloud the eyes of others, a system of special admissions committees was invented, thanks to which the young man managed to get there. The hero graduates were needed by this world through the Demon King. Capable children were prepared for a possible war against the forces of evil. Wesley's avatar's power was to reduce pain for 30 seconds. In the man's opinion, such abilities were not something special, much less a reason for pride. He didn't understand at all why he was accepted into an elite institution. Fortunately, after being brought into this world, Wesley received personal divine power. The sword god's blessing looked much better in terms of characteristics than the previous skill. Just like this avatar, the sword blessing has never been encountered by a chef in the game before. The condition for activating the power was the presence of a very specific artifact in the player's hands. By all accounts, Russell's ideal weapon was the sashimi knife. Even in another reality, he couldn't get rid of his job as a chef. All that was left was to find and purchase a weapon somewhere in order to effectively complete the training. The only problem was that in this world, even the lowest rank artifacts were very expensive. Without equipment, they wouldn't accept anyone into the academy, and this was stated in the letter, so expenses were unavoidable. The family's plight would not bother anyone there, so Wesley decided to go shopping. The guy chose a popular, extensive chain of stores as his destination. Fortunately, the man understood perfectly well that it was not the instrument that was doing something wrong, but the hands that were guiding it. The next morning, as agreed with his parents, Russell headed to the academy. There, a menacing-looking master was waiting for him, who was supposed to check whether the students had weapons. A freshman brought with him a set of sashimi knives at a 30% discount. Noticing the teacher's loud astonishment, both lines of applicants looked in their direction. The controller decided that the young man was simply making fun of him in this way, as this happened every year. Therefore, I decided to immediately emphasize that jokes are not welcome here, because entrance exams are a serious matter. But Russell calmly replied that it was indeed his weapon. Anticipating another hysteria from the instructor, the guy continued calmly. He stressed that he comes from a poor family and therefore cannot afford large expenses. Because of this speech, the interlocutor finally noticed the green badge of the special student. And Russell's remark that degrading weapons is something only amateurs can do shocked him. The teacher immediately felt that the wisdom in the newcomer's head would come as a surprise to many in the building. He had no more complaints. There were only tears in my eyes from the realization that such an enlightened person appeared in their ranks. The instructor approved Cadet Russell's choice of weapon and cleared him for training. This dialogue took place under the close supervision of potential competitors. They found the prospect of studying with someone from an ordinary rather than an aristocratic family ridiculous. Perceiving this as a problem for himself in the future, the young man was surprised by the instructor's lightning-fast reaction. The husband immediately stood up for the vulnerable teenager and made everyone present ask for forgiveness. Once on the grounds of the academy, Wesley allowed himself to rest. Now, the only stress he has left is the entrance exam itself and being assigned to a class. Russell had to study at the Hero Training School for 3 years, and this was his new reality. It must be noted that the spectacle was truly impressive, like a city within a city. Suddenly, the student felt like he was part of an elite society. This contrasted with his real life, when his family went bankrupt and he had to lower his standards. The thoughts and memories were interrupted by the announcement of the start of the exam and the general meeting of newcomers. The young man took one of the sashimi knives out of his bag and examined it. He remembered very well that in order to activate divine power, he needed to hold a weapon in his hands. For the money he paid in the store, the artifact turned out to be not so bad in quality. Time to check compatibility. Wesley pulled his gear out of the case. At that very moment, activation began and an electric current ran through the guy's body. The notification stated that the weapon and body preparation levels were too low. Therefore, the system decided to suppress the divine power in order to synchronize with the user. The second it happened, Russell's body felt like it was struck by lightning. The pain was unbearable. The young man couldn't stop it on his own. He even suspected that he would most likely die from agony before taking the exam. A moment later, the picture before my eyes changed. Wesley's consciousness found itself in some other space. It was as if the entire game world had split into pieces, revealing the real Matrix. This realization shocked the chef so much that he dropped the knife. The lack of synchronization between the artifact and the avatar instantly fixed everything. The guy was standing again at the bench in the middle of the academy park, and although sweat was pouring down his forehead, physically everything was normal. Only the echo of pain still wandered inside, as did the fear that all this would happen again. The strange trip made Wesley think about the power of his powers. If such torment were to arise every time, the divine power of painlessness would come in handy, and he won't be able to use his more than once every 12 hours. Another announcement prompted Russell to call a meeting, which meant the artifact needed to be raised again. He hoped that the experience would not be repeated, but deep down he knew that it would not be so. And, once again touching the artifact, he began to scream in a voice that was not his own. The training hall resembled a coliseum, with a crowd of students filtering through the structure's many arches. Everyone was waiting for the entrance exam to begin. Many of the cadets knew each other, but the rich people's social circle seemed limited. But despite their status, they were all fans of one person. It was the hero of the Seven Stars, Keith Zik von Nibelung, a venerable warrior of haughty appearance. He was a student of the founder of the Joaquin Academy, the majestic Joaquin Valor. Today, this man was considered the strongest on the planet, and this definitely caused admiration. No one around him had any idea how different his noble status was from his inner world. Paige Poison suddenly appeared next to Keith. The woman was a real thorn in the side of the respectable man, but her position obliged her to sit next to him. Today, they both have to make decisions about the applicants and monitor the progress of the struggle. They had been doing the same thing for about 50 years. In fact, these two shared a very rich and personal history that each of them would rather forget. Today was different from previous entrance exams due to the presence of Keith's grandson. The girl had to show her abilities, although no one doubted them. No one except her grandfather, who was too picky about everything. Among the entire crowd at the Coliseum, only Russell felt out of place. What made him a special student was not only his poor family, but also his conservative appearance. He looked around at everyone with boredom, remembering the unpleasant conversations about himself. Unexpectedly, the young man's eyes were not focused on the silhouette of the girl entering the arena. This was the same heroine that Wesley always admired while playing the game on his phone. Her beauty and long blue hair amazed everyone around her. The granddaughter of the Sword Emperor, Annabelle von Nibelung, was the center of the Academy's universe today, and also the main character of the game, on which the chef spent a fortune at one time. A special place, subspace, was created to undergo the tests. It was a parallel reality where everything felt real except death. An ideal environment for fighting where none of the participants could suffer real injuries. Paige Poison considered this a good tradition of the school, but suggested a new format. The participants had to be divided into groups of 10 people, thus determining the best. There were no restrictions on the battles, so everything depended on the imagination of the applicants. The woman, as a director, considered this system ideal, despite Keith's criticism. Meanwhile, Russell was looking closely at Annabelle. Now that she was more than just a 2D character, her beauty seemed to pierce the heart. He knew perfectly well that none of the students who were here now had a chance. This girl's blessing was off the charts at M. That's why only the main character of this game could become her partner, and he hasn't appeared here yet. That's why Annabelle had more than enough fans and they weren't going to give up. Russell seemed to be the only one who had not succumbed to her magic, although this was a deceptive impression. He just wanted to finish his studies, get a job, and lead a life without getting into trouble. Just the mere mention of his sensations from touching the knife made the young man shudder. And although deep down Wesley suspected that this story would not be simple, he did not strive to become a hero. The entrance exam began with an explanation of the rules. In each group, first, second, and third places will be awarded, which in turn belong to the Star and Dragon classes respectively. The fate of other candidates is to study in regular classes. The entire training program at the Academy will depend on the initial exam. The system will automatically calculate the results regardless of the time of the test. After the rules were explained, the journey into subspace began. Russell's main goal was to avoid opportunities to get a knife. Gradually, the band members rematerialized in the arena, trying to gather together. First, second, and third places were determined, and everything seemed to happen very quickly. But the director and the cat were busy discussing the abilities of the grandson of the legendary family. Paige insisted that there was no need to worry about Annabelle because she was doing well. Of course, the legendary warrior knew the value of his blood and did not consider its results to be an outstanding result. He was only interested in the entry of his grandson, while other candidates were like ants to him. It was not worth the attention and the time spent, so the man was about to leave without a shadow of regret. At the same time, only one group of participants remained in the subspace, in which Russell was located. The sudden jolt of energy affected everyone in the arena, even Keith. People froze in anticipation of something amazing, and very soon the situation changed. Strange objects appeared in the sky and were rapidly approaching. It could have been anything, a threat, or something blessed. But when the curtain of subspace broke, everything became clear. It could only be one of the students. Everyone held their breath. The winner was expected to appear in the arena soon. And then, like a bright star from the sky, Russell fell to the ground along with his equipment. Since the boy didn't move, the director immediately called the medics. No one, except the members of this group, yet knew what events were taking place in the subspace. And there was a real mess going on there. The weak participants were immediately eliminated by the arrogant representatives of the privileged class, the twin brothers. At first, Russell decided to simply observe the course of events. But the Iron King's family members, Carl and Terry, seemed to only get angrier. And this began to greatly anger the knife master. For 30 minutes now, no one could fight them back. But it never got to his turn, even though his hands were already itching from inaction. Gradually, the subspace was increasingly cleared of students. Easy victories overshadowed the brothers' minds so much that they did not even notice the entire competitors. Terry's attention was drawn to a girl who stood calmly at a distance and seemed to not want to fight. She shook like an aspen leaf in the wind. It was the attack on this defenseless target that activated the true feelings of a protector within Russell. The swordmaster gritted his teeth. He hated it when the weaker ones were humiliated with impunity. Meanwhile, Carl had already headed towards his opponent, preparing to finish everything with one blow. He didn't just want to get rid of his competitor. He longed to hear her pleas and see the fear in her eyes. One of the maniac brothers raised his fists up, preparing to strike. At that moment, Russell spoke out of the darkness. The massacre stopped instantly. Realizing that he was bringing unnecessary trouble upon himself, he could not let the scoundrels offend him. A moment later, Carl and Terry realized that they were looking at a special student. He was wearing a green badge. This caused a brazen laugh in the face of the interlocutor. They did not consider him strong. Carl rushed forward, preparing for a short fight. Terry, however, remained at a distance, encouraging his brother. Russell was faced with a problem that needed to be solved urgently. The need to pick up a knife seemed inevitable, but it was frightening because of the pain that could arise from it. The sword god's blessing in his case could only work when activated and painless. Everything he had promised himself before about using this technique now had to be broken. Making a deal with his conscience and fear, Russell took up the sashimi knife. The hero was filled with a glow of powerful energy that amazed everyone nearby. Even the girl in distress forgot about her situation and concentrated on what she saw. Carl took Russell's position as a personal insult and promised to destroy his opponent. He jumped up to attack the enemy with a moving trajectory. Wesley had only half a minute to deal with the villain, and he regrouped. He himself did not know what he was capable of with this weapon in his hands, so he was not offended by Carl's cries. The man was not embarrassed to admit that deep down he was simply afraid. In 50 years of life, he had never attacked a person and did not know what he was essentially capable of. But everything turned out to be much easier when you just put your thoughts aside and start acting. The enemy's arm separated from his body in a second, and at first he didn't even feel it. Carl fell to the ground screaming in pain. The aristocrat did not expect such a turn of events. Up until this point, Wesley had never been able to get his teacher to talk about such topics. He was no ordinary cook. He used to work for the mafia as a thug. And when the master got tired of killing people, he even went so far as to amputate his wrist in order to get out of the game. The man later opened his own restaurant, took Wesley on as an apprentice, and kept him on his toes. It was this eccentric who taught the young man how to skillfully use a sashimi knife. Between the fierce beatings, the boy always received proper instructions and guidance. And now, probably, the master would not be proud of him at all. But the man had no other choice. In this world, you had to play by different rules. During all these memories, Carl managed to get to his feet, but was only busy screaming. The first time he was injured was in sparring, and the ignoble personality of the enemy further drove him into depression. When Russell started moving towards him, the villain had nothing left but panic. He was truly afraid, so much so that he forgot about his location in subspace. Terry, who had been watching his brother all this time, was also amazed but was in no hurry to help, despite the many relentless pleas of the injured relative. Even when Carl's head was cut off, the guy simply analyzed everything that was happening and built a strategy. Terry had no idea that anyone here could compete with them, except the obvious elite. The brothers felt completely safe because they were in other groups. They considered themselves sharks in this ocean. Russell waited for his opponent to make the first move, even though his time was running out. And it was not for nothing that the opponent finally realized that he would not say goodbye to his life here. Moreover, this special student, for sure, just now cut a person for the first time. It was obvious to the naked eye, but the prospect of losing was still frightening. To improve his chances in the fight, Terry donned one of his brother's gloves. Indeed, this increased the defense, maneuverability, and striking power of the aristocratic representative. Having activated all the gadgets and enhancements at once, the last twin finally attacked. Insolence prevailed again, and the opponent's inaction inspired confidence in his own superiority. Russell, meanwhile, was simply counting down, the incredible pain frightening him more than the fight. Terry was already very close. The last seconds passed quickly, just as the knife master's hands moved. The villain received his share of wounds, which clearly demonstrated his true abilities. Of the two opponents, only Russell remained standing. He understood with horror that in just a second the horror would begin. And indeed, when the blessing of painlessness ended, the subspace shook from the youth's cries. He didn't remember how he appeared in the arena, and didn't understand where he was when he finally opened his eyes. Now the student was lying on a soft bed in a room that looked like a hospital ward. With great difficulty, Russell sat up and looked around. A strange man, who at the same time looked into the room, loudly announced that the patient had woken up. A minute later, Wesley, in the body of a young man, saw the legends of this game entering inside. Nibelung. The cat and page. Poison stopped at the bedside of a boy who had no idea why they were there. The director of the academy was the first to start the conversation. She was extremely friendly. Russell was even at a loss. He didn't know what to answer. The world's strongest man preferred to get straight to the point. He wanted to know what really happened in the subspace and what kind of force the academy was facing. And the guy, as if by magic, began to remember the events of yesterday. It seemed like a dream. Now the young man realized that he had most likely done something unusual and that it did not bode well. Lying wasn't an option, so Russell simply admitted that he had used more force than necessary. A tense silence fell in the room, which the director violated again. She wanted to talk casually, but immediately began to violate the student's personal boundaries. The woman did not miss the opportunity to poke fun at her old colleague again. This led to a new quarrel between them. The cat was especially vulnerable in front of strangers. The director was very proud that such a talented student would study at their academy. She informed Russell that they had reviewed the subspace footage of the battle and seen his nobility. The way he rushed to protect the defenseless girl was the act of a true hero. It turned out that somehow the twins had entered the selection illegally. And now, thanks to Russell's courage, they have admitted their misbehavior and want to be expelled. This news, like a bolt from the blue during a drought, eased the boy's feelings. He lost the potential hooligans with whom he was constantly in conflict. But the most important news that came to him made Russell open his mouth in amazement. It turned out that the special student got the best results on the entrance exams. This meant that he should be classified as an elite class. But this reality was not what he expected. Life threw up an unexpected surprise. Taking a day to think, Russell used it to make a strategic decision for the years ahead. Paige Poison sat in her office, unaware that she would have such a conversation today. In 20 years of working as a principal, she had never seen a student who would refuse such prospects. But the special student really wanted to refuse to be assigned to the best class. The star class was the best in the academy, and Paige honestly didn't understand what this weirdo's brain was guided by. Together with Keith, they began to explain to Russell that the system was never wrong in its calculations. But despite the arguments and anger of the elders who intimidated him, the student insisted on his own. The strongest man in the world at that moment forgot about the pride of his kind. He was guided by other aspects. The system created by the hero founder was beyond any doubt. It's just that this guy's level of development has been the man's goal for many years. Fruitful work on yourself, self-improvement, and mastering many techniques. Creating a holistic concept, your own line of combat, is something you come to with age. The cat believed that such a level of skill could only be achieved in this way. But touching the wounded boy's body, unblocking his meridians, he felt another force. It was as if he hid within himself a wiser essence, completely out of character for his years. This aroused in Keith Nibelung envy and a desire to compete with a worthy opponent. The husband admitted to himself that he had not experienced such a long-forgotten feeling for a long time. Today, the world's strongest man knew that Annabelle would have to jump above his head. Since Russell did not bend under pressure, we had to agree to his terms. The dragon class was occupied by students who were second in the entrance exam group. Everyone refused to make big concessions to him. He had to come to terms with his fate. Although it wasn't easy, both sides barely survived the dispute. And now, Wesley, who had no idea that he would be going to school again, was facing a new challenge. The auditorium was already filling up with students who were looking at the newcomer with interest. Russell was incredibly glad that he had persuaded Paige not to reveal the identity of his best student. Otherwise, his green badge was now perceived somewhat differently. A typical reaction of the elite. Laughter behind his back and gossip calmed the guy down a little. He didn't even try to meet anyone or communicate with anyone until graduation. Remaining invisible in such a crowd seemed impossible. But for a quiet life, the loner tactic seemed ideal. Suddenly, the guy heard some sounds near him. Looking up, he saw the same red-haired girl he had saved in subspace. She seemed unable to squeeze a sound out of herself. And Russell had hoped the speech wouldn't be some kind of thank you. But that's exactly what it was. The knife master was quick to point out that he did not need gratitude for his pursuit of justice, especially considering that it was also in his personal interests. This dialogue became a good opportunity to get acquainted. The freshman introduced himself as Russell, and the girl, bashfully, replied that her name was Chloe. Wesley, as an avid player of this app for all the years and passing of the game, did not know this character. After some brainstorming, the knife master decided that she was most likely a secondary character as well. The acquaintance was interrupted by the appearance of the teacher, who immediately showed his capricious character. I had to shift my focus to more mundane things like learning. The lecturer was the chief instructor of the dragon class. His name was Oliver. He immediately suggested starting training classes instead of theory. The students tried to challenge this decision, but the man remained adamant, naming the standards that would need to be met. Russell was in no hurry to go to the locker room. He had no desire to go back to the army, so the guy decided to use a trick to get rid of physical activity. Approaching the teacher, the first-year student said that he was feeling unwell. But, to Oliver's great surprise, first of all, he knew his name. And secondly, he immediately reminded him that he could return to the star class as the best student. At this point, Russell realized that his agreement with Paige Poison was not entirely fair. The woman told all the teachers about his achievements, so there was almost no room for maneuver. 20 minutes later, Wesley, who had not played sports for many years, walked out onto the stadium. The first task was to run, and the knife master immediately felt great discomfort. He was out of breath and wanted to stop immediately and rest. But the teacher's close supervision did not allow this to happen. All the marathon participants were in full view. On the next lap, Chloe approached him and noticed that he was having some kind of problems. At first, Russell tried to save face, pretending that things weren't so bad. But when he found out that he had been overtaken by almost 5 laps, his spirits were completely down. This was evidence that Wesley needed to devote more time to sports all these years. And today, he could only count on the support of others. And although it was unpleasant to admit, his physical condition was the worst on the course. Russell spent most of his time praying to the gods not to fall down on the path, exhausted. So the whole Sunday of hellish workloads passed. Physical exercise in this context was not the worst thing. Since Russell did not come from a wealthy family, he quickly developed nutritional problems. In this academy, food cost a lot of money, which ran out almost immediately. The young man's stomach was twisted from hunger, and he quenched it as best he could with plain water. And this situation became more and more threatening, because it seemed there was no way out. There was no one to ask for help or to count on a sudden influx of money. In the canteens, payment was made only by food coupons, and prices soared through the clouds. Russell could only study the menu and salivate from hunger, as if they were teasing him at the academy. Time passed in such torment, and finally, even water could not quench the thirst to eat a piece of freshly cooked meat. That evening, the hunger became completely unbearable. We had to come up with something urgently. Apply your skills somewhere and get a job. Russell tossed and turned in bed, trying to fall asleep, but he couldn't, his stomach growling with discontent. The only progress was the improvement of physical condition, which opened up new options. But here too, everything came down to money, because to activate new capabilities you need specific weapons. In general, the first-year student's body already looked completely different. He acquired an athletic appearance. Thanks to Keith's help in cleansing the vessels, the young man now felt much better. The knife master hoped that one day fate would smile on him, and he would be able to move on to a full-fledged sword. Although in fact he still felt uneasy at the very thought of picking up a sashimi knife. Thoughts about the future and introspection were interrupted by a knock on the room door. Chloe stood at the threshold, her voice trembling as she tried to suggest something. It turned out that she was worried about her savior's absence from the dining room lately. To avoid looking embarrassed, Russell preferred to pretend to be a capricious gourmet. He didn't yet know that fate had brought a real gift to his door. Chloe wanted to invite him to dinner at her place, although she did not claim to be a chef. She hadn't even finished her sentence when her interlocutor flew out of the room, fully collected. Russell hadn't been this happy in a long time, and he liked it even more that he had to leave for a long time. When the first-year student invited her friend to her place, she had no idea that he would be the one cooking. She didn't know that for several decades, fish had been the specialty of the young man sitting opposite her. Wesley, who was sitting in this avatar, was delighted that Chloe's fridge was stocked with this food. The only problem was that, due to his skill, he couldn't just pick up a knife. The girl's kitchen arsenal included exactly the same sashimi knives he had bought for his studies. That's why he even asked first if Chloe had any other weapon for such purposes. But in the girls' dorm room, besides the obvious, there was only a real sword. Therefore, the guy had no choice but to prepare the dish using painlessness. 30 seconds was enough to surprise the mistress of the house. After only 20 years, the hero prepared unsurpassed sashimi, according to the best standards of his past life. But he was even happier that everything went off safely enough for life. Once the job was done, Russell still had to answer many questions about his skills. Of course, without going into details, he said that he worked part-time in a restaurant for some time. This information made Chloe feel embarrassed because she came from a wealthy family. She didn't understand what it meant to make a living, but she appreciated the guy's skills. Grateful for the delicious dinner, she agreed to clean up the dishes. And during this, Russell was finally able to exhale deeply. His stomach was not empty. The pleasant heaviness improved my mood and put off thoughts about my critical financial situation. Under Chloe's constant apologies, the young man washed the dishes for the first time and looked around. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a notebook that fell from a nearby shelf onto the table. It was a diary kept by a girl, and her handwriting and drawings were visible on the opened pages. Russell came closer and began to read what was written there. This not entirely good business captivated the guest so much that he could not tear himself away from the pages, on one of which the knife master read about Chloe's sympathy for him. What the girl described could be called falling in love. Her behavior became more understandable. The next page put everything in its place. There were thousands of pieces of knowledge and love for him. Russell froze in place at what he saw. He didn't know how to react to it. The broken dishes and Chloe's voice brought her out of oblivion. She realized what the young man had read. The knife master did not know that he had gotten involved with a representative of a family that solved the personal problems of the elite. The De Sicilia clan liquidated the enemies of rich people on order, supposedly maintaining stability. Each family member has gone through various psychological tests since childhood, and the girl was no exception. She had been suppressing her emotions her entire adult life. According to the elder, by hurting people and remaining calm, she gained inner strength. At 15, Chloe had to kill a man. The girl didn't like it, but everyone around her demanded that she accept this way of life and this terrible creature. At that time, she had no opportunity to resist, so she had to submit. Since then, the freshman's psyche began to become more and more distorted, hiding her wounded soul. In this state, the girl was enrolled in the academy. Almost nothing remained of the real her. But even here, Chloe was not free to make her own choice. Members of the De Sicilia family were expected to remain invisible, regardless of their abilities. This has been the clan's agreement directly with the Joaquin Academy for many years. The freshman did not rebel. She resigned herself to her fate and future. Everything changed during the entrance exam when Russell appeared on his path. He prevented the twin brothers from killing her and finally fulfilling the elder's plan. Thus, Chloe ended up in the dragon class, fully meeting all the criteria. It seemed that fate itself had decided everything, contrary to the law of the family. During the royal battle, the girl felt for the first time that she was floating to the surface from the deep bottom. Russell acted completely freely and unconditionally, which immediately won her heart. What happened was like one of those fairy tales that every child reads at a young age. Chloe became a princess who was saved from trouble by a knight. It was this analogy that awakened the flame of love in her heart, the first bright and pure feeling that was born from a good attitude towards her. She fell in love that very moment in subspace and couldn't do anything about it. But it was a secret she could not confess to anyone. The girl's heart literally stopped when she tried to talk to Russell. Therefore, his actions awakened in her an incredible feeling of shame. A deep silence fell in the room. Gradually, the knife master began to feel that something was going on that was a little strange. So I immediately began to change the subject, feeling awkward. Since Chloe continued to remain silent, the guy's instinct for self-preservation kicked in. Russell began to move towards the door, saying goodbye to the hostess. But she suddenly began to move. She explained in a calm voice that it was her diary. And there is no need to play roles in front of her. Everything is clear. The young man read the confession. When Russell confessed his crime, Chloe's behavior changed dramatically. There was another girl standing in front of him. She grabbed her sword, preparing to attack. There was nowhere to run. The guest was trapped between the desk and the window, and Chloe's room was on the 4th floor of the dorm, too high to jump. The sudden anger of his new acquaintance confused the guy. He could not understand such behavior. It was necessary to urgently build a defense strategy. This didn't look right at all. Looking into Chloe's eyes, Wesley in the avatar body realized that in front of him was none other than a yandere. The radical change in mood from cheerful to warlike was more eloquent than any other signs. Split personality in this context was a dangerous threat. That's why the exit was behind the girl, and she had no intention of stopping. Besides, Russell was unarmed, which left him in the kitchen for sashimi. Time passed. The enemy approached. Suddenly, he saw a stationary cutter next to him. It was better than nothing, especially when Chloe rushed forward. He had to defend himself, although he didn't want to do it at all. Much to the boy's surprise, all of his skills were activated, even with such a weapon. Of course, Russell did not want to harm the owner of the apartment, so I decided to apply my skills to her hair. Thus began a fleeting duel. Chloe slowly opened her eyelids. She was confused because Russell had disappeared from her room. For some reason, the girl herself was lying on the bed, covered with a blanket. The recent events erased from her memory. The last thing she remembered was washing dishes and her friend looking out the window. For some reason, the katana standing next to her made her uneasy. Since the blade didn't drop its sheath, I guess I could breathe a sigh of relief. She remembered well how her first memory lapse had ended. This dark half of her personality has not shown itself so aggressively since then. It seemed like there were no casualties, but Chloe still felt bad about what happened. The crazy killer certainly didn't have any character traits that the guy would like. She wanted to know urgently what had happened, but she didn't have the courage to do so. Suddenly, she noticed a paper cutter on the floor. This raised even more questions in the girl's head. It seemed like a fight had broken out. The next surprise was that the freshman's hairstyle was updated and everything fell into place. Chloe was captivated by the fact that, despite the danger, the young man tidied up the apartment. This gave him a chivalrous air in the eyes of the young murderer in love. She hastened to immediately write down her observations in her diary. Meanwhile, Russell himself kept his emotions in check. Besides, he was late on the timing, which is why he now felt an echo of pain. But the most important thing was that the melancholy that rolled in waves cleansed the full stomach. After everything the boy had been through, A little later, he again felt an unbearable desire to eat. He was also interested in the personality of his new acquaintance, who had turned into a real fury. She certainly didn't intend to kill him quickly. On the contrary, she wanted to prolong the pleasure. If it weren't for his own skill, he would have remained a corpse at her place. He managed to counterattack from behind and adjust her hair a little, and this saved the knife master's life. What happened this evening was further evidence of the lack of peace in this academy. All that was left was to adapt to the new realities and be prepared for any surprises. The game he was in was called Blessing, and its main character was supposed to appear. The guy's name was Bruce, and he had a legendary ability. This guy was considered the patron of humanity and the main exterminator of demons. He had the Balmung sword at his disposal, while Russell himself only had regular sashimi knives. The vast gap between Bruce and Wesley's avatar was disturbing. It seemed that great ambitions should be abandoned, despite numerous achievements. But he still could not understand what, in that case, his role was in all the events that were happening around him. But soon everything should fall into place because the main character has already gone through the enrollment procedure. So far, the official plot hasn't deviated much from what Wesley knew. According to calculations, life will begin to deteriorate in about 3 years. So you will need to prepare for this moment as best you can. For the intensity of clashes between demons and humanity will only increase after this. Perhaps the most exciting teenage life that the chef had been deprived of as a child fascinated him. It was the romanticism of the relationship between the game's heroes that encouraged him to continue his activity in it. Did I know then? Could I have guessed that I would end up in this world myself? Since his life was now at stake, he had to think about a survival strategy. Clearly, the only right choice was to develop your avatar in every possible way. This had to be done wisely, without causing unnecessary attention or suspicion while remaining in the shadows. Moreover, Russell's relationship with the sword god's blessing increasingly affected the state of the body. There was an urgent need to somehow improve relations with this force. The hero noticed that the system had added new points to describe this skill. They required counting. A lot of new information and strange terminology confused the guy. Russell eventually decided that the first order of business would be new weapons and increased physical training. It will also be necessary to master the skills of combat with weapons to perfection. This can save lives. Luckily, martial arts lessons were scheduled to start in just a few Sundays. The boy chose the Murasame katana as his main weapon during classes. Its characteristics did not match the requirements of the sword god's blessing, making the artifact ideal. Russell was so immersed in his own thoughts that he didn't notice Annabelle appearing next to him. The girl wanted to sit next to me and seemed a little irritated. The young man was a little confused at first because he had not planned to enter into a dialogue with his crush. As a result, an awkward silence formed between the first-year students. A minute later, Russell, as requested, nevertheless moved to the side. Fortunately, Annabelle didn't demand more. She was completely satisfied with this solution. While the girl was deciding how best to calm down after intense cardio, the young man couldn't take his eyes off her. It seems she was saying something, perhaps we could have had a casual conversation. But Russell couldn't get a sound out. Now he understood Chloe well. Luckily, Annabelle knew nothing about his personality or skills. The only thing the cat told her was that the boy owned a sword. Therefore, the girl believed that a common feature could bring them closer together. She even offered to test her own sword. But the strange interlocutor was in no hurry to do this, which made Annabelle a little embarrassed. She began to behave strangely, in the context of what the knife master had managed to understand about him. The granddaughter of the strongest man suddenly became interested in her neighbor on the bench. She referred to the fact that everyone knows her personality, but she, on the contrary, knows almost no one. But she didn't accept any excuses, for if someone refused to give their name, in her understanding they could be a spy. Russell was in no hurry to answer. He suspected that the impromptu interrogation was not accidental. He explained that he was in the park in the evening only because he just wanted to get some fresh air. And this once again incredibly confused the interlocutor. But very soon this feeling was replaced by irritation. Everything was not going according to plan. In general, she was worried from the moment of the entrance exam. The girl felt the pressure of her entire family for not taking first place in the space. It was the first time this had happened, and it wasn't planned because it seemed like the whole world was already in her pocket. Now, Annabelle wanted to know who this impudent fellow was who had deprived her of her primacy, and not to congratulate, rather the opposite. To find out who, after all, is actually better. Of course, such words alarmed Russell seriously. While the interlocutor described the horrors awaiting the competitor, the guy came up with a reason to run away. Suddenly, the girl stopped speaking and smiled. She explained her motivation to the young man. In her eyes, Russell looked weak, so she could allow herself to behave freely. Moreover, during her life, she was never able to find real friends. Surprisingly, she felt calm next to the stranger, but fatigue was a sign. The guy, in turn, still remained cold towards her. He still refused to give his name, wanting to stay away from unnecessary problems. A few more days passed and Russell calmed down completely. It seemed that all the dangerous moments were in the past, and he had again gone into a calm existence. The main daily routine was avoiding contact with Chloe. He understood that the girl wanted to talk, so he didn't even look in her direction. Thank all the gods in the dragon class. He wasn't the only special student from a common family. And this made interclass relations a little easier and made bullying impossible. Although the rich were rather unpleasant individuals, they ignored him with their attention. Life has improved not only in this aspect, but also in the most important thing, food. Principal Page was concerned about money. Being a top student had its perks. A special card for a faculty member gave him almost unlimited opportunity to fill his stomach. In the guy's eyes, Miss Poison had now become something of a real goddess. He thanked her mentally almost every day for this kind deed. Studying at Joaquin Academy had its pros and cons. History lessons were especially boring, while the first years were going through everything that Wesley had already managed to memorize in his past life. So the knife maker was incredibly bored. Now the discussion concerned the hero of Joaquin Valor. This man once fought with the Demon King's top henchman. Lycan was a powerful commander of the First Legion, who until that point considered himself invincible. This battle lasted 20 years and ended in a terrible defeat for the benefit of Hell. But the man also emerged from this fight wounded. He lost his dominant arm and could no longer participate in fighting. The loss of the strongest representatives of the two races gave rise to a terrible war. Fortunately, both enemies had exhausted each other so much that they agreed to a temporary truce. This is why the Academy was formed, so that humanity could prepare the next heroes. For 700 years, a precarious peace still existed, but every day this could change, which gave rise to anxiety in the hearts of contemporaries. Russell alone knew with absolute certainty what future awaited humanity very soon. But this knowledge had to be kept to oneself because publicity could change the future, and not for the better. The hero understood perfectly well that the director of the academy would not be able to fulfill his dream of quitting. Her almost supernatural intuition will help her sense the approach of a terrible tragedy. According to the script, Paige Poison was one of the first to stand up for humanity. Now Wesley regretted deleting the game before finishing it, but he knew the woman would die. This news shocked him when he read about it. Since he could now get to know the director better, such a future seemed terrible to him. Lost in his own thoughts, Russell didn't even notice how the lecture came to an end. The first-year students hurried to the exit, excitedly discussing something. Snippets of dialogue made the boy understand that that same day had arrived. Looking at the phone screen, Russell confirmed his suspicions. May 5th was the day Bruce appeared. The Knife Master was the last to approach the exit of the lecture hall. He already knew what he would see there. The main character of this world, without greeting anyone, walked along the corridor through the crowd. There was no emotion visible on Bruce Van Reinhardt's face. Today was the beginning of the end. It wasn't long before Russell began to get annoyed by all the fuss. This arrogant blonde guy was very popular among the female sex, and this was the reason for the formation of a whole team of guys around him. And if it weren't for his subsequent fate of being drafted into the army in the front ranks, the Knife Master himself would have killed him. Bruce will be facing hell, literally. Perhaps it is in this war that the main confrontation between the hero of humanity and the king of demons will take place. But because Wesley never finished the game, he was afraid that humanity would fall. But suddenly, a completely rational thought dawned on Russell. They were in a game called Blessing of Miracles, so the ending was already known. Bruce is bound to win because that's the concept behind these types of genre stories. Being at the center of events, Russell himself felt the full influence of the hero's charisma. But it was necessary to come down to earth. It was time to start improving my own character. The Knife Master decided to spend this evening in the training room. He was practicing basic weapons fighting techniques and had already managed to develop several calluses. Without an opponent, it was difficult to understand what level of progress the young man was at. The choice of acquaintances in this establishment was not particularly large. So the next day, even Chloe's candidacy didn't seem so crazy. Fortunately, the girl decided to approach the guy first and start a conversation. Now she didn't look as formidable as she had back then, at home. The determined thirst for murder was replaced by guilt and shame. During the unexpected pause, Chloe finally pulled herself together and suggested a second dinner. This time she offered to cook to thank him for his kindness and understanding. The unexpected proposal left the young man at a dead end. He didn't want to fight anymore, but he didn't want to insult his interlocutor either. Chloe looked very cute as she waited for her crush's verdict. Not wanting to cause further trouble, the guy suddenly suggested another option. He needed help with his wrestling practice. The interlocutor happily agreed to meet me halfway, without knowing the details. Russell suggested an evening meeting to teach fencing. During an unexpected confrontation with the girl, the guy realized that he was a strong and experienced warrior. Therefore, before the training began, he spent a lot of time studying the information. Chloe showed up at the gym a little earlier than the scheduled time. To be honest, an hour and a half earlier, she wanted to be useful. Thanks to the clothes the girl chose, Russell was able to assess the physical fitness of his opponent. Now that he saw the press with his own eyes, he understood that it was the result of persistent, many-year-long workload. The training was not supposed to be life-threatening, so the young man chose wooden sticks instead of weapons. Judging by Chloe's reaction, she apparently never used such a prop. The red-haired first-year student tried to feel the new type of weapon in her hands. She waved it a few times, but even so, she looked quite menacing. It's unclear why, but just before the start, Wesley suddenly became afraid for his avatar. He wanted to make sure his skills were effective. And although there was an obvious increase in possibilities, in the knife master's mind this was not enough. As he studied the system window, he didn't realize that it looked pointless. To Chloe, it all seemed like her friend was just hanging there, lost in his own thoughts. And she made it clear right away. Wesley instantly caught himself. It was obvious that this was a game only for him. The guy announced that he was ready to start sparring. Both opponents took their initial stances. None of them were in a hurry to attack. The opponents walked in circles, looking at each other. The knife master believed that with the help of such training, he would make a significant leap forward. He was willing to give it his all to reach peak condition. At first, analyzing the girl, the young man came to the conclusion that she was not very confident in her actions. Suddenly, Chloe rushed forward. This confused the hero, because a new person appeared in front of him in a matter of seconds. The opponent's speed was very high, and Russell barely had time to get his bearings to avoid a collision. At that moment, he realized that dreams of gradually increasing the loads would remain only in his head. With each new blow, the opponent only increased the pace, and the guy felt like a loser because he didn't go to acrobatics. He found it difficult to resist the intense pressure, and the training seemed hellish. At times, Russell was able to block Chloe's attacks, but there was no time to rejoice because the girl attacked again and again. She tested his weak points and used them against him almost without fail. Despite the furious pace, the red-haired freshman didn't even lose her breath. The training poles were already bursting at the seams, but she had no intention of stopping. This indicated that Chloe was not fighting at full strength, unlike her opponent. Russell's broken wooden sword screamed about it within a few minutes. The girl, realizing that she had gone too far, immediately began to apologize to her friend. She didn't understand that something strange was happening to the young man at that time. The weapon failure system immediately made a mistake. Since the avatar was in danger, she lowered his humanity level. Of course, the game didn't understand that it was just a training session. Russell's heat skill was activated. Damage to the weapon made it impossible to defend, so it was necessary to immediately change strategy. To achieve this, the system was going to use coercive force. The blessing of the sword god took on new colors from that moment on. Wesley's consciousness separated from Russell's body and plunged into some other space. He found himself in the ordinary interior of a restaurant kitchen. In front of him, instead of Chloe, the man saw an ordinary fish, from which he needed to make a dish. The system gave him several types of knives to choose from, but in reality, she didn't leave any opportunity to do what he would like. It blocked any other artifact except the sashimi knife. This time it felt more pleasant to hold it in my hands than usual. It didn't hurt. The fear that had raged in Wesley's soul at the mention of gunfights on recent Sundays immediately passed. He didn't understand that in reality, in some incomprehensible way, he had given the levers of control into the hands of the system. Meanwhile, he himself remained in the fictional space, having left the avatar. The change in the young man's behavior very soon made it clear to Chloe that amazing things were happening to her friend. He looked like a real zombie, even staggering from side to side a little. But at the same time, he continued to silently move slowly in her direction. Suddenly, the guy's speed became lightning fast and he reached almost the enemy. Even with a broken wooden stick, such an opponent made it clear that he had dangerous plans. Chloe had to put in all her efforts to hold her position, but it was all in vain. Russell pushed the girl away from him with a powerful attack. She flew almost across the entire hall. The red-haired first-year student could not understand such a sudden change in the young man's skill and behavior. This was a completely different guy, not the one she had imagined all this time. It was necessary to urgently bring him back to his senses before terrible things happened. The training fight could be forgotten because the guy's blows indicated an intention to eliminate. Chloe began to beg for the sparring to end, but no one heard her. On the contrary, Russell rushed forward again. She understood that with the injuries she had already received, she would not be able to avoid the collision in time. So I just begged for the guy to come to his senses. When his stick was already raised above her head, she simply screamed his name. At that time, in the world that the system had created, Wesley could not understand why he could not deal with the fish. She literally spun around on the board, not allowing herself to be cut. This was the first time in his practice that preparing sashimi had created such problems. In addition to all of the above, an annoying female voice was repeating someone's name. The name of a certain Russell. It took a couple of minutes before the man realized that this was his avatar in the world he found himself in. This meant that somehow he abandoned the body and was not in control of it. Chloe was in danger. As evidenced by her screams, the fight needed to be stopped immediately. The hero began to fight for his free will with all his might. At the last moment, he managed to gain control of himself, and the piece of stick flew into the wall. The sparring partner did not expect the danger to pass. She simply grabbed the young man and did not let him go, even when he came to his senses. Only Russell's voice brought the girl out of her stupor. The young man wanted to stop the battle. He didn't want to answer questions because he didn't know what to say. First, he needed to sort himself out, so the freshman politely said goodbye and left, leaving Chloe completely at a loss. She walked home, analyzing everything that had happened before. It was obvious that her comrade had become extremely strong, and it had happened suddenly. The amazing power disturbed the girl, who had seen all sorts of strange things since childhood. Now she understood that Russell had great potential, and she needed to learn from him. The freshman's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of a figure waiting in the darkness. It was her brother, testifying to the unpleasantness of the conversation. David Auditor was a second-year student at the academy and had an aggressive personality. Now, as always, he was dissatisfied with his sister's behavior. In the guy's opinion, she acted like a fool because she chose to associate with the weaker. From the dialogue, David learned Russell's name and immediately began to threaten him with violence. This outraged the girl. Throughout her life, she had been oppressed and had her own vision imposed on her. Now she strove to live according to her heart and knew that her comrade was safe because of his strength. She left David in deep thought. Now his attention was completely focused on the impudent freshman. At the same time, at home, the hero finally understood the idea that he did not have a blessing. In his opinion, such power was a real curse because it deprived one of free will. She carried the avatar away swiftly, leaving no option to avoid the inevitable. So at some point he could kill anyone who stood against him. At the same time, there was always a rage inside that grew progressively, demanding destruction. She left behind pain and a desire to take control of the situation. It was only Chloe's cry of pain that brought him back to his senses, and it was this incident that probably saved her life. Wesley's first priority was to study his body and skills in more detail. During the previous fight, he was scared that the girl was a yandere, but now he understood that he himself was much more dangerous than her. He felt incredible gratitude towards Chloe. Thanks to her love and trust, everything went without casualties, and he understood what he had to work on. New circumstances made it clear that Russell had the potential to become one of the main heroes of the game world. A normal life without adventures could finally be forgotten. Most likely, the Avatar's body contained some other consciousness besides Wesley's personality. She was darker and more powerful, and most importantly, she wanted to manage Russell at her own discretion. Therefore, in this world, man has identified the blessing of the Sword God as the main danger for himself. 3 days of sparring passed, and the training continued as usual. The students went to class and got to know each other better. Only Russell wasn't among them, and Chloe was at a loss as to why. It seemed that the situation was much more serious than all possible assumptions. The worst thing was that she had no contact information for the young man, only the room number in the hostel, but no one opened it. With each passing day, his lack of concern in the girl's heart only increased. She missed her savior incredibly. On the 4th day, the lecture by the chief instructor began, and he immediately turned on his usual aggression. He would have liked to immerse his students in hard training as always, but the weather was on their side. As he spoke about what was planned, he looked around the audience trying to find Russell among those present. But the guy was absent again, and now there were 2 people concerned about the fate of the student. Suddenly, in the middle of the lecture, the classroom door opened, which caused the instructor's indignation. But his anger died down almost immediately when the one they were waiting for came out of the darkness into the light. Russell walked silently down the stairs, heading to his row. He looked different. Chloe jumped in surprise when she saw her crush's face. But despite this, he restrainedly apologized to the teacher for being late. The instructor allowed him to take a seat, trying to analyze what exactly it was about the guy that bothered him so much. Whispers swept through the audience, everyone discussing the changes in Russell's appearance. The young man himself clearly heard the thoughts that were raging around him, but he did not react to them in any way. After the lecture was over, everyone began to go about their business. Only Chloe was eager to find out what had happened in those few days. But the young man remained closed to any questions and assumptions. He answered in monosyllables and insisted that nothing had happened. He thanked Chloe for worrying about him, thus ending the discussion. The girl had no choice but to agree with his decision. She didn't want to impose herself. According to the young man, no one should know what torment and suffering he experienced over the course of 3 days. He reached the point of complete mental exhaustion. In addition, constant pain in the body had already become a habitual background. All this time, Russell was trying to finally take control of his avatar's body. As a result, the first-year student's appearance changed, and he developed gray hair. The powerful experiences did not go unnoticed. Although in other respects, Everything remained unchanged. Observing his interlocutor's reaction, the young man suddenly realized that she felt guilty. Therefore, I decided to meet the girl halfway and free her conscience from suffering. He suggested meeting her at her house that evening for a plate of delicious food. They had discussed this before and he thought it would be a great idea. Chloe's reaction was instantaneous. She went from near panic to happiness in 1 second. She was ready to cook for him at any cost and was already making plans for the menu. The tense dialogue turned into a fascinating discussion of the preferences of each of the interlocutors. But the attention of an outsider could not escape Russell's vigilance. Not far from the guy and the girl stood a red-haired stranger. He listened silently to their dialogue, but radiated hostility. Looking back at the young man's gaze, Chloe realized that there would be a conflict. A tense silence ensued, during which the opponents stared at each other. Russell approached the stranger and spoke first, demanding an explanation. Anticipating David's response, the girl rushed forward and took up a position between the boys. According to her, the hero realized that the red-eyed stranger was Chloe's brother, and she was not on his side at all. It seemed that the relationship between the relatives was not working out, and Russell was the obstacle in this. The guy was surprised to realize that Chloe and David were auditors. According to the knife maker, they were radically different, but overall everything immediately fell into place. A fellow student demanded that the girl stop communicating with Russell immediately, otherwise there would be consequences. But she was categorically against it and defended her desire to communicate with whomever she wanted. From the time when Wesley played on the mobile app, he remembered the history of this family well. It was a shadowy group of assassins who dealt with sensitive issues. They hardly took part in open battles. The descendants were subjected to terrible trials from childhood, which broke their psyche and turned them into murderers. Of course, that's why some representatives went crazy and the auditor's skills were not in doubt. In front of him stood real killers, one of whom was ready to do anything to follow the rules. Maintaining order between the influential families in this world also concerned their lineage. From Chloe's reaction, it was quickly clear that she was resisting the influence of her relatives and wanted to be autonomous. But it was almost impossible to get out of this quagmire without losses, which Russell did not want at all. In general, the world of this game seemed more and more cruel to the knife master every day. He didn't want Lavrov to be a hero, but at least he could take this issue upon himself. One girl's life could change because of his actions, and he didn't want to miss that chance. So Russell decided to rely on his abilities. Auditors recognized the language of power. He said he had an exquisite proposal for David to resolve the conflict. Without going into details, he offered to follow him. Meanwhile, the chief instructor sat in his office, analyzing everything he saw. The changes in the academy's top student have caused concern, as if he is not an ordinary young man. But the analysis had to be interrupted due to an unexpected visit from his assistant, Kimberly. And the phone ringing completely threw the man off his stride. It turns out that Russell requested the activation of subspace to conduct the duel. He chose David Auditor as his opponent, which was quite unexpected and raised many questions. With about 15 minutes left before the fight, the participants had time to collect their thoughts. Russell was surprised at how quickly the issue of opening subspace was resolved. This made the whole problem of what he had planned much easier. There was no need to restrain oneself. At the same time, it turned out that such fights arouse great interest among other students. Obviously, this curiosity did not play into the desire to remain incognito any longer. But it was no longer possible to change anything or roll back events. This would have been perceived as cowardice. Chloe, who was always next to the guy, perceived the duel as her personal fault. And no matter how much the young man assured the girl that she should not take events to heart, she continued to cry, not accepting this point of view. This was due to the fact that she knew who David was and what he was capable of. Now all the hopes of the family were placed on the second-year student. He was considered the strongest of the descendants. This information led Russell to believe that he was lucky in his choice of enemies. Now the teacher's words about what the boy would not let go of for the rest of his life seemed prophetic. The discussion and reflections were interrupted by the announcement of the activation of the subspace. The young man stood up silently, prematurely borrowing an extra knife from Chloe. The girl was pale as a sheet. She did not move from her place looking after the guy. So he decided to calm her down one last time. The knife master was sure that his opponent was losing, and he didn't care what others thought about it. He walked out of the locker room full of determination. But the sight of the crowded arena puzzled the guy. There were hundreds of students and teachers around, chanting words of encouragement to their favorites, including him. The sight finally made Russell smile. Among those present, the young man noticed representatives of the highest nobility. The presence of descendants of powerful families, including Annabelle, amazed the first-year student. The girl's arrival meant that his cover would fail after all. He immediately remembered the words of Keith's granddaughter about the massacre of the academy's strongest student. David's appearance put all thoughts to rest. The sophomore killer demanded respect. A small squabble broke out between the boys, during which Russell managed to hurt the auditor's feelings. In Chloe's brother's opinion, the impudent weakling was acting too brazenly. So David immediately pulled out his weapon. It turns out that the second-year student wielded two swords called Purple Wheel and had armor. Oddly enough, Russell immediately sensed all the advantages and strengths of his opponent. He slowly took out his weapons, the sashimi knife and the rose dagger from Chloe. When both opponents gave the signal, the space let them in. The audience stood tensely, watching what was happening on the screen. The duel began. The first thing Russell did was activate the Sword God's Blessing and the Painlessness skill. The fight developed so quickly and aggressively that spectators began to doubt the peacefulness of the action. The speed of both opponents' movements was truly astonishing. No one expected this from a first-year student. Russell seemed to overcome all obstacles with ease, creating problems for David. Even the VIPs understood that something unusual was unfolding before them. The one who was most shocked was Annabelle, who until that moment had considered the guy weak. She recalled their dialogue on a bench in the evening park, and many questions for the young man were born in her head. The freshman looked like a real pro who competed with dignity and skill with the sophomore. David, in turn, tried to create incredibly difficult fighting conditions for Russell. He used his best tricks and techniques. It seemed that quick and unexpected attacks should not give the opponent a chance to avoid defeat. Once Russell even found himself in the epicenter of an energy storm. When the boy disappeared into a powerful whirlpool, David decided that he had finally gotten it. But this was a premature assumption, because the guy appeared before the eyes of those present without a scratch. Some students mistakenly believed that the second-year student was forcing a weaker opponent to run around the arena. But Annabelle saw the essence of this fight. From her point of view, Russell simply did not want to fight. He avoided it. David, in turn, after many attempts to eliminate his opponent, realized that his sister was right. Although the freshman moved with ease to those around him, it was difficult for him to maneuver with two knives. A change in strategy was required, and the first decision was to get rid of one of the artifacts. The sashimi knife fell to the ground, creating an echo that bounced off the silent walls of the amphitheater. Everyone, including David, froze, trying to understand Russell's behavior. Now the boy only had Chloe's rose dagger at his disposal. He took a comfortable stance, preparing to attack. The second-year student did not understand how the young man was going to attack. The position seemed senseless. In David's opinion, this was a fatal mistake by the enemy. He prepared to attack, feeling that he could end the fight now. Such arrogance cost him too much. The whole time in the arena, Russell could only think about how to get out of this situation. But there were no options left. I had to fight for real and show my true colors. A second later, from an awkward position, he cut off one of David's hands. He didn't even have time to react. The freshman seemed to become lightning. All that was left was to watch him go and reproach myself for my disdainful attitude. There was silence in the arena, and the beating of the spectators' hearts could be heard. Now, an unknown special student has become the center of attention at Joaquin Academy. Russell knew full well that after this fight, there would be many more to come. All those who considered themselves candidates for the championship will want to take revenge. After David was finally eliminated, it was all over. Subspace has announced the end of the session. The winner was determined without any effort on the system. The spectators looked silently at the two opponents who appeared in the center of the arena. While David was recovering from his own death, Russell calmly sheathed his knives. Without a doubt, this was the most spectacular fight of all that took place this year. Before them stood perhaps the most talented warrior of all. It was a real revelation which the crowd greeted with tense silence. To be honest, Russell didn't enjoy using his skills to kill a man. That's why he chose subspace, to avoid the real unpleasant consequences of his actions. David was a worthy opponent. Chloe had a point when she said that he was the hope of the auditor family. The guy's experience was obvious to the naked eye. The system declared a winner. The result was clean and impressive in Russell's favor. Thus, it became official that a first-year student defeated a second-year student. The first wave of popularity was supposed to catch up with the young man tomorrow, but now this did not depress him at all. The choice was finally made. As Russell had predicted, the next morning at the academy, all that was discussed was the duel. The students sang his praises in unison, but until now, they could not remember the name of the special student. Annabelle also kept thoughts about the guy running through her head all this time. She did admit that the duel had been outstanding, and the attention was entirely justified. Over the course of the day, Annabelle reflected on what had happened in terms of surprise and sudden luck. But now, sitting in the audience, she began to understand that it was not a matter of luck. A guy named Russell used regular kitchen knives. Until yesterday, the girl had no idea that it was possible to fight so skillfully with ordinary tools. This showed that the present situation was extremely exceptional. That guy on the park bench was that same top student at Joaquin Academy, and he wanted to remain incognito, not satisfying the girl's needs to know his identity. The rage that came with this opinion made Annabelle lose control of herself. She felt cheated, not realizing that no one owed her anything. Charlotte, who was sitting next to him, did not understand at all what this sudden outburst of emotions was. But Annabelle's reaction to her questions interested the girl even more. Now the blonde wanted to find out what exactly was going on. She wasn't going to give up so easily and bombarded her friend with questions. Annabelle tried to hold on and not give up her position, but the pressure continued to increase. And when the conversation turned to the boys, the girl could no longer control herself. This was exactly the reaction Charlotte was expecting. Her friend's red cheeks encouraged the blonde to redouble her efforts in the impromptu interrogation. Annabelle's stubborn silence made it clear that the object of her thoughts was unusual. At first, Charlotte's choice was directed towards Bruce, the obvious option. One might even say the most obvious one. But still, not faithful, the granddaughter of Keith Nibelung firmly answered no. Then there was only one option left. Freshman Russell, the eccentric who conquered the arena. When that name came out of Charlotte's mouth, the situation became obvious. The blonde immediately expressed a desire to find out all the circumstances on the spot and dragged her friend along with her. Despite the resistance, they went to the dragon class. Luckily, there was a break in the right room. The students did not at all expect to see the cream of local society in front of them. Charlotte didn't pay attention to anyone. She had a specific goal. The girl quickly looked around the audience looking for Russell. She ignored the negative comments directed at her, feeling impunity. Annabelle, watching her friend destroy school property, clutched her head. She was ashamed. Finally, the blonde's gaze caught sight of a sleeping guy from the crowd, not paying attention to anyone else. Charlotte was not at all worried that she might disturb the young man's rest. According to the girl, this made her appearance more impressive. And then, a few seconds later, in front of a stunned Chloe, she leaned over Russell's ear. According to the first, the blonde behaved too brazenly and daringly. But there was no time to intervene because the boy raised his head, reacting to Charlotte. He was so tired that he couldn't immediately understand who was sitting in front of him. Annabelle's friend, meanwhile, said that nothing had happened. She wanted to get to know each other. There was only one thought spinning in the young man's head. This visit did not happen just like that. While he was discussing how to avoid trouble, Chloe intervened in the conversation. A moment later, the behavior of the auditor family representative changed dramatically. Only Russell noticed this. The tension around him was rapidly growing. He had seen this state of the girl before, and her behavior was very dangerous for those around her. Chloe pulled out a box cutter, and the guy gritted his teeth. A fight was brewing. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Annabelle appeared and began to pull Charlotte away, also suggesting a conflict. But the blonde was not going to back down. She wanted to show that she was much better than the red-haired girl. Having come dangerously close to her opponent, she had no idea what threat this posed to her. Just when Charlotte's attention was already focused on someone else, Chloe took action with lightning speed. Using a stationary knife, the girl stabbed the blonde in front of the astonished spectators. Fortunately, there was no first blood. Annabelle's friend had a good reaction, much faster than Chloe. The elite representative held the attacker's hand, continuing to mock her. Keith Nibelung's granddaughter couldn't allow anyone she knew to bully her. She tried to stop Charlotte, but she threw Chloe away from her like a rag. The unfortunate blonde didn't know who she was running into. The girl regrouped in the air and was ready for the second round. The students in the audience took up vantage points to watch the latest fight. Charlotte Demura came from a clan that relied entirely on its strength. She was not averse to competing with someone, but she wanted to know the reasons for the aggression. The assumption that the two were dating turned out to be incorrect, according to Russell. His answer seemed to anger Chloe the most. He could feel it behind his back. He needed to somehow get out of this situation, so the young man could think of nothing better than indignation. And he pretended to accept the girl's visit as an ambush, which was not far from the truth, and he asked about the purpose of the visit. Charlotte wasn't going to make up stories, so she told it like it was. He interested Annabelle. The friend, having heard what was being said, immediately rushed to object, citing the blonde's initiative. She didn't want everyone around her to talk about a possible affair involving her. But it was precisely Annabelle's intervention that aroused even greater interest in their dialogue among those around them. Listening to the girl's senseless explanations, Russell waited for them to finally leave. Since the miracle did not happen, the guy decided to help them with this. The young man's sharp reaction confused the visitor. But Charlotte wasn't going to give up, so she immediately pretended that nothing had happened. The girl even suggested meeting after class on an impromptu date. Hearing the blatant flirting, Chloe went ballistic. No one had the right to encroach on her crush. The blonde took Russell's friend's growls with laughter. But that was at first. After a moment, even Charlotte sensed danger. Therefore, in order not to lose face, the girl quickly said goodbye to the young man. She left in the company of Annabelle, promising to meet again, and despite objections. Realizing that this dialogue was over, Russell immediately tried to sleep again. He no longer cared about anything in the world. Unlike the grandson of Keith Nibelung. In front of the astonished first-year students, the coolest girl in the academy silently walked out of the classroom. On the way to her wing, she thought about what had happened and the young man's endurance. Since their first meeting, Russell had changed significantly. Some kind of darkness was brewing in his soul. Charlotte also noticed the boy's extremely restrained anger, and this awakened curiosity in her. Entertainment, unexpectedly, turned into a goal to get to the truth. Since strength was the driving force of the girl's clan, this candidate was worthy of becoming her husband. Of course, she didn't fully understand Annabelle's feelings for Russell, so she decided to take things slow. Charlotte didn't want to ruin her relationship with her friend at all, and she, apparently, was furious with her behavior in the dragon class. The blonde decided to first draw the line and announced her plans for Russell. Meanwhile, David, still reeling from his defeat, went mad in the infirmary. He had never lost in his life and didn't even know how to accept it with dignity. The hope of the Auditor clan wanted revenge and wanted to do it in family style, secretly. From now on, all the attention of the crazy maniac was focused on the impudent first-year student. To carry out his vendetta, he was not even afraid to call on his family for help. Hiding behind Chloe's fate, the guy lied to himself that he was not striving for personal pleasure. When everything fell into place in his head down to the smallest detail, David decided to act. He opened the door of the ward with the intention of contacting the elders and the stunned ones. In front of him sat Russell himself. The freshman was definitely waiting for him. But, in fact, the appearance of a first-year student here was quite natural. The day after the incident with Charlotte, he decided to ask Chloe how her brother was doing. This allowed us to kill two birds with one stone, calm the girl down, and find out the consequences of the duel. Russell's question obviously left his interlocutor stumped. She wasn't particularly interested in David's fate because of the cool relationship, but she knew he was in the hospital. Realizing that the mention of doctors could lead the boys to terrible thoughts, the girl hastened to calm him down. But already at that moment, Russell had definitely decided to visit his former enemy. I had to make sure that this red-haired madman had nothing else in mind. So now, sitting in the ward of a sick person, so to speak, the young man was doing exactly this. The freshman pretended that there was nothing surprising about this, but David himself was indignant at the slightest movement of the visitor. To be honest, the hope of the Auditor clan could not understand at all what he owed such attention to. What worried him even more was the idea that someone had reported his location to the enemy. When Russell reached for the knife lying on the bedside table, the second-year student tensed. He thought the guy had decided to finish what he started in the arena. But to the young killer's surprise, the freshman simply began to peel the apple. Without rushing, the guy dealt with the skin of the fruit and put the plate on the table. Having wished the patient a speedy recovery, the hero turned towards the exit. When the stupor passed, David decided to seize the chance for revenge, for he perceived everything that happened as a mockery of himself. But Russell forestalled him with a stipulation that he should not even think about hunting him. Looking back at the second-year student cinematically, he promised to destroy the entire Auditor family for this. Such a loud statement sounded like a bolt from the blue and immediately stopped the opponent. When the door slammed behind the visitor, the apple on the table suddenly began to change. A moment later, it fell apart into several pieces before the eyes of a shocked David, who was unable to stay on his feet. As Russell walked home, he hoped that this impromptu intimidation would work as well as possible. Of course, the last threat was not true, because his power was not effective against everyone. Such a preemptive strike served as the best prevention of future troubles. The freshman's situation became increasingly tense. It was as if he was walking on a sharp blade, barely keeping his balance on the edge. But this, at the same time, meant that he had achieved something in the world of the game and had become someone to be reckoned with. After today's visit, there was only one problem left for him: Charlotte. The girl's strange behavior did not fit into the previously known scenario. Her attention was not concentrated on the bruise. The guy decided to deal with her after the main event, the exam. There, he could get what he wanted, the Murasame sword, and significantly improve his skill. But the problem remained that the exam was held in a group format. It was necessary to create a team. With capable partners, significant progress could be made. Overall, the exam didn't frighten the young man, but there were some nasty monsters there, like a sea monster. She looked like a half-fish with human limbs and was immediately appealing. Russell would rather fight the mermaid than these creatures, but the latter were considered demons, and therefore were not allowed to participate in freshman competitions. During his month at the academy, Wesley himself did not understand how he managed to integrate into the local rhythm of life. Only at night it was very quiet here. Despite 700 years of peace, conflicts between the two races still occurred here and there. For example, 50 years ago, the 6th Legion commander began an offensive operation. Bassman wanted to fire the first commander sealed by people in the Great War. The release of Lycan was met with strong resistance from humanity. The strongest hero of the 7 stars at that time entered into a confrontation from which he emerged victorious. It took the man a whole Sunday to do this, but it was not without casualties. In the end, both warring parties came to an agreement. Thanks to this, such a fragile peace reigns on Earth to this day. Russell still couldn't understand what kind of power Joaquin had, that he was able to imprison Lycan on his own. It was really impressive. The guy hoped that Bruce would reach the same level before he was 3. Another outbreak of war could not be avoided, so it was necessary to prepare better for it. The most important thing in such things has always been allies, and that is what was missing now. In this matter, Russell now relied only on his sudden popularity. After the epic battle in the arena, the young man had already changed his priorities. Now he was not oppressed by attention, but everything turned out completely differently than he expected. Sunday passed and he received no requests. The freshman did not at all understand the reason for such behavior of those around him. It seemed to him that his reputation was already running before him and was the cause of the excitement. But teams were being created around him without his participation, and it seemed that those around him were simply afraid. He was not alone in this situation. The story was similar in Chloe. It seemed like they were outcasts, and people like that should stick together. So Russell decided to take action. He suggested that the girl join forces and find 3 more participants together. The proposal was very quickly approved by the interlocutor, and her mood noticeably improved. For some reason, in this world, someone always interrupted the dialogue, and this time, Charlotte distinguished herself. She allegedly came just to talk and again did not pay attention to the fact that no one was happy about this. Such impudence again threw Chloe off balance. She immediately grabbed the knife. To avoid another scuffle, Russell abruptly ordered the visitor to leave. Demonstratively changing her mood like a mask, the girl ignored this call. It is quite obvious that she was driven by some specific goal that required a solution. After a few seconds, Charlotte voiced what was bothering her. Of course, it was the exam and the commands. Since Russell never found anyone to lean on, which he himself admitted, the blonde happily invited him to join their team, a group of elites. The hero immediately understood the subtext of this invitation, so he was not going to accept it. But the girl was persistent. She sought his participation in order to get closer to the object of desire. Russell had to explain that he had already teamed up with Chloe and was just looking for 3 more members. But before he could finish his sentence, Charlotte made an announcement that they had 2 vacancies. This changed the situation that the Dragon class students found themselves in almost completely. Charlotte was considered one of the strongest representatives of the elite and gave a good chance of winning. All that was left was to hope that Chloe could control herself. After some thought, Russell agreed. But he was interested in where exactly he had just agreed to join. More details were needed. It turned out that the leader of the group was Bruce himself. This statement simply blew the guy's mind. It was as if he was flying full speed straight into a concrete wall. Such a storyline could draw him deeper into the war than he had hoped to delve into. And Wesley, sitting in the body of his avatar, was not at all eager to die for the fictional world. If Bruce was the captain, that meant Annabelle was in on the act with him. When the man was playing this app avidly, he couldn't even imagine that he would see the main characters in real life. Agreeing to join the team could change the system settings and, as a result, the future of this world. In any case, it is impossible to refuse because Charlotte has already agreed on everything, according to her own words. Now all that was left was to wait for the disaster that would inevitably occur due to ill-considered, hasty decisions. There was one more unknown in this equation. Chloe's reaction to his decision. She did not hear the conversation. And now, she was interested in his strange behavior after Charlotte's arrival. Fortunately, the unexpected news was received much better than he thought. The girl looked at this experience as a path that was beneficial to both parties. Russell also decided to focus only on the positive aspects of this union. He was not alone, but in the company of the strong. As agreed with Charlotte, the first meeting with the team was supposed to take place today. The guy and the girl didn't even notice how time flew by while they were talking. After classes, the young man and Chloe went to a cafe to meet for the first time. While the girl was enjoying the drink she had purchased, Russell was choking on his coffee. It was not tasty at all, but it was the only option that suited the price policy. Therefore, the first-year student did not show that he was not satisfied with anything. From this experience, the hero learned that he would never drink espresso again in his life. It turned out that in the whole group, only the 2 of them were punctual. Charlotte and her friends were not there yet. After several messages, the rest of the group finally showed up at the door. Only the blonde radiated positivity and goodwill. The guys immediately crossed their eyes, trying to predict what this union would lead to. Russell was also surprised that Annabelle was not there. Her place was taken by a participant unknown to him, a tense, red-haired boy. The young man's appearance was somewhat provocative, as if he were a member of a gang. Bruce was the first to make contact. He came up to introduce himself, radiating cautious goodwill. The boys shook hands. Russell, of course, was afraid to admit it to himself, but the magic of his interlocutor worked on him too. He had spent a lot of time playing with Bruce's avatar, and now it felt different. The team captain decided to start the meeting with a personal summary of each of those present. After the main speaker's speech, it was Charlotte's turn, who immediately passed the baton to the third. The disgruntled red-haired boy called himself Speed Weapon. He was a fan of all heroes. The tattoo on his neck eloquently testified to this. Russell was tensed by such a short resume. The impression of the young man was not very positive. Chloe, behaving like a lecturer, stood up and began to talk about herself. With all her might, she restrained her negativity towards the blonde and delivered her speech in a very restrained tone. All this time, the three opposite listened silently, without expressing any reaction. Finally, it was Russell's turn, but the boy was unable to finish his speech. Suddenly, Bruce interrupted him. The guy reached for his laptop. He proposed to begin discussing a plan of action. Using projection, the group's head reproduced the location's relief. The map of Scopuli Island was sent to all group leaders by the professor himself. This location was quite real. Only the path to it ran through subspace. Therefore, everything there will be different from the entrance exams. The possibility of injury could not be ruled out. The area of operations for their group was determined to be the northeastern region. In this sector, there will be 3 teams in total, competing to kill monsters. The one who liquidates the most will become the leader and receive a reward. In the end, there was nothing more to know. The test was simple in its essence. Despite Speed's concerns about the demons, Bruce immediately reassured everyone. There wouldn't be any. Chloe, for example, was interested in confrontation with other groups of students. From the captain's point of view, there was no need to waste time on this, because the objective of the task was clearly defined. Russell didn't have a single question for him. The main thing was preparation. Since it was clear to everyone, Bruce ended the meeting, leaving only independent training. While the others raced to the exit, the group leader and Wesley's avatar were left alone. The situation became not very comfortable, so the Knife Master decided to silently leave this space. But the hero stopped him halfway. It was odd because he was the one who interrupted the guy's resume. But Bruce was interested in Russell's personality. Moreover, the blonde was interested not only in the guy's strength and class, but also in his origin. This question could be interpreted in any way. The hero seemed to sense that Wesley was inside the avatar. But this curiosity could also be due to the more obvious boundaries of this world. The circumstances also raised concerns. There were no witnesses left nearby. It increasingly seemed to Russell that he was about to find himself in a trap from which there would be no escape. Bruce, meanwhile, explained his curiosity by the fact that he felt an extraordinary resemblance to his interlocutor, and this remark caused cognitive dissonance in the Knife Master. Although there were no races in the game, she and the guy were completely different visually. So what was the point? Since Russell didn't seem inclined to answer questions, Bruce quickly ended the conversation. He even noted that they should forget this dialogue. This time, it was the Knife Master's turn to stop his interlocutor with the same question. He did it subconsciously, not fully understanding his motives, with an incomprehensible hope. Bruce replied with a smile that he had come from Germany, and this was even stranger than the previous questions. Russell felt a little cheated, as if the team captain had gone off topic. At some point in the conversation, it seemed that the conversation would be about another world. From that evening onwards, the young man often caught himself thinking that it seemed he was not the only one who had been stolen by the game. This theory needed to be backed up with facts, so he decided to sharpen his senses with skills. Taking the sashimi knife in his hands, Russell activated the blessing of the sword god. He asked the system what worried him most. Were they similar to Bruce? But the pain and sensations that immediately woke up inside were reminiscent of a past experience. My head began to ache excruciatingly, and painlessness had no power to stop this pressure. The question still remained relevant. The person in the cafe looked more like an avatar than a person. Besides, there was not a single mention of Bruce Van Reinhardt on the internet of this world. Russell hoped he could find out the truth while he focused on the issues at hand. In any free time, the Knife Master tried to improve his skills. And indeed, according to the system data, his indicators increased. So there was definitely progress. He developed his body. All that was left was to improve the weapon's performance. Gradually, each of the criteria became more understandable, but there were still some white spots. For example, adaptation. The young man did not fully understand how it could be developed. Perhaps frequent fights were to blame for everything. The worst thing was that such questions could not be resolved without help, and there was no one to ask. It was nice to hear that the painlessness had somehow been extended to 40 seconds. Russell's eyes flashed back to all his previous torments when in contact with his own weapon. During my stay in this world, if you think about it, a lot has changed. Time passed, and the day of the exam gradually approached. With each meeting of the group, the relationship between them became warmer. Independent training with Chloe also bore fruit. The only thing that still didn't go away was the hatred towards Charlotte, who didn't stop flirting. Russell decided to spend the last day before the test in the training room. This time the guy didn't invite anyone with him. He wanted to feel his own power without limits. By morning, all the students had gathered at the designated place, in front of the subspace gates. The Knife Master carefully examined everything that surrounded him. The young man was brought out of his contemplation by the voices of the group awaiting his arrival. By agreement, Charlotte acted as the main dealer today. Bruce was supposed to be in the center, as the leader of the group. Speed was far from being separated from the commander. He played the role of a protector. Chloe was appointed as the second dealer on the team. And Russell was put in last place. He was supposed to protect the rear. The knife master looked at his comrade's equipment with importance and was struck by Chloe's sword. And the flute in Speed's hands was quite surprising. It was an unexpected choice. Charlotte entered into a dialogue, explaining all the features of this instrument. It healed. It was a rare artifact that would have been worth a lot of money in the game, despite its shape. So Russell decided to examine it in more detail, which caused the owner's indignation. Suddenly, the system's voice announced the start of the exam, and all conversation stopped. The head instructor came out to the students with a motivational speech. He called on the students to take care of their own integrity and not to act heroically in vain. After the speech, Bruce took over the senior voice. He suggested the opposite, to give it our all. The goal was unconditional victory. The other teams took the information in silence. Russell internally prepared himself for a fierce fight. Only Chloe looked too worried. The girl could not shake the thought that there might still be representatives of the mermaids on the island. The confidence of the rest of the group did not convince her at all. The situation could always get out of control. She no longer wanted to bother those around her with her premonitions, so she decided to be on guard. The instructor ordered all groups to line up and prepare for teleportation. Russell decided not to stray far from his friend during the transition. It was time to go on an adventure, and it was the right decision. Thus, the representative of the auditor family came to her senses a little. Faith in her crush gave her strength and, in some incomprehensible way, improved her mood. Chloe will not immediately realize that she is about to lose control of herself due to an overflow of emotions. It will be dangerous in the context of increasing risks, but Russell will bring the girl to her senses. No one, not even himself, will know that his anxious premonitions should have been trusted. Having lost contact with the academy, their group still manages to stumble upon the mermaid. And at that moment, students will be able to rely only on each other. Scopoli Island must have been a beautiful place, and nausea prevented one from enjoying it. For some reason, 3 out of 5 participants had exactly this reaction to teleportation. The team captain was incredibly surprised by Russell's endurance, which did not affect him. The conversation had to be dropped because not even a minute had passed before the first monster immediately ran out to them. It was a sea monster, the most disgusting creature from the point of view of the knife master. But, fortunately, this specimen was not very large. It looked like a baby. Bruce, who had already managed to pull himself together, confirmed that giants were waiting for them on the way. Chloe had already been conducting a reconnaissance campaign, and the group decided to follow in her footsteps. They slowly plunged into the forest thicket. Soon, the correctness of the laid-out route was confirmed by the appearance of the representative of the Auditor clan herself. The girl jumped from branch to branch at high speed and landed in front of her comrades. She assured that this is the only way to move around the island without attracting unnecessary attention. It turned out that there was a large cave ahead, less than a kilometer away. The students decided to continue moving in that direction. Of course, this place turned out to be a nesting site for sea monsters. They huddled around the fire, trying to warm themselves. 50 or 60 fish was a good catch to start with, but a plan of action had to be made. Russell certainly had his own ideas about entering into open confrontation, but he was not a leader. The main decision had to be made by Bruce, and he was in no hurry. At this time, the blonde remembered all the group meetings that preceded the exam, and the distribution of responsibilities that was assigned to each of the participants. Then, he distributed their responsibilities according to the strength and power of each one separately. But in times of real danger, they all had to unite into one punishing fist. After once again analyzing all the pros and cons, Bruce finally made a decision. He ordered Charlotte to immediately go on the attack, and the girl did not keep him waiting long. She threw her spear straight into the monster cell. Having covered an astonishing distance, the artifact landed right in the fire around which the freaks had bathed. At first, the half-fish recoiled in horror. Their next action was to find the culprit of the disorder they had caused. Charlotte, who appeared above the monsters' heads, put everything in its place. She quickly grabbed her spear, and with the next move, he took the lives of 2 opponents. This is exactly how the girl was supposed to behave according to Bruce's instructions. She could easily cope with the task of smashing everything to pieces. The girl's inflammatory nature and wayward disposition allowed her to act with ease and speed, and at the same time not receive damage, being under the cover of Speed's power. Indeed, the boy's flute had an amazing effect on the sea monsters. They were so scared that they didn't notice anything around them except the music. Charlotte successfully took advantage of this, destroying the half-fish one after another. The death toll had already exceeded 20 and was continuing to increase rapidly. So far, the team has managed to overcome the first obstacle without collective intervention. It was a stunning sight for Russell. Chloe, in turn, did not want to stand around doing nothing, so she decided to join in the destruction. With her weapons and skills, she quickly raised the stakes. The red-haired beast demonstrated extraordinary agility skills. None of the monsters could withstand such power. They were too slow. Just as they were about to attack, the monsters were already being crushed. Soon the two opponents reached almost the same number of killed individuals. But for some reason, they didn't even think about stopping. The guys, who were closely following the course of events, suspected that a clash was brewing within the group. The appearance of a giant sea monster changed everything. Finding herself between two girls, she tried to attack both of them at once. But this was a false decision. They dealt with it almost instantly. The teamwork was impressive, as if these two had always worked together. Although physically the girls were in a skillful symbiosis, morally they still kept their distance. The tense moment made Russell's heart skip a beat, expecting the worst. But, fortunately, everything turned out for the best. Bruce noticed the Knife Master's concern. He had not been in the loop of the recent conflict. The main thing for the leader was to defeat 60 monsters at once. Now it was possible to move on. A good start had been made for the operation. Russell, who had been there by himself throughout his stay, gradually came to understand the essence of teamwork. He even managed to calm down about the possible likelihood of a similar situation with Bruce. Moreover, for the team, the next moment everything changed radically. The group commander was suddenly lifted into the air. At first, no one understood what had happened. Looking back, the students froze in place. Russell realized that Chloe's concerns were not unfounded. They were attacked by a mermaid, and now she was very angry. It was a dangerous encounter because none of the students present had any experience fighting demons before. At first, the students were panicked and didn't know what to do. To run or to fight? That was the million-dollar question. Since Bruce's injury seemed serious, the only hope was for help from the teachers. But it was not possible to establish contact with the latter, and this led to panic. Since the Knife Master had not lost his self-control, it was he who took command. And just as Chloe was going deeper into herself again, the guy brought her back to consciousness. It is the representative of the assassin family, thanks to her abilities, who must convey the news to the teachers. The Academy should have known that the first-year students had entered into a confrontation with the demoness on their own. Once all the responsibilities were assigned, everyone began to play their role. Speed was supposed to support Bruce and help Charlotte with the sea monsters. Russell himself decided to personally deal with the mermaid and not expose anyone present to danger. In fact, the fight with the half-fish was much more unpleasant for him than with the pure evil. In front of his astonished comrades, he pulled out his sashimi knife, ready to fight off the monster. In this world, demons also had superpowers based on magic, thanks to which the mermaid managed to injure Bruce. Therefore, none of the heroes could feel an advantage in the confrontation with representatives of this race. Up until this point, Wesley had only experienced such encounters when playing on a mobile app. Now he was faced with another unknown journey that could turn into a disaster. This fight needed to be stretched out for 10 minutes so that Chloe could warn her elders. And given his own skills, the Avatar had only 40 seconds to eliminate the threat. Delaying it was inevitably pointless, so Russell activated the blessing of the Sword God and painlessness. While the Knife Master prepared for an important battle, Charlotte tried to tame an army of sea monsters. This time the monsters turned out to be more agile, perhaps due to the presence of the demon. There were times when it seemed like the girl was in danger, but after just a few seconds the blonde found a chance to get out of it to her advantage. She wanted to provide a reliable rear for her brother, who took on the main battle. But worrying about the guy deprived her of the lightness that was before. Only rage remained. She didn't ask Speed for help even when it was time for transfusions. But he, watching and ensuring his friend, wanted to somehow unload this burden himself. Just like Bruce, whose treatment took almost all of the healer's strength. For some reason, Russell's confidence in his abilities was never in doubt. The team trusted him. It was clear from the time of his first public fight that he was a very strong fighter. But now, in front of him stood not just an opponent, it was a demon. And such determination looked insane. There was no time to replay everything because the mermaid launched the first attack. She used the same blow on Russell that she used on Bruce. But the guy deftly dodged, rushing forward to counterattack. He understood perfectly well that, although the opponent possessed magic, it was mostly water magic. She still remains vulnerable due to the materiality of her body, which resembled a human one. So to gain superiority, you had to be close enough to hit the target. Russell jumped fast and far enough to find himself a meter away from his opponent. It came as a surprise to her, especially when he stabbed her. Before the astonished Speed's eyes, the mermaid turned away at the last moment. But this did not help to avoid the collision. The hero connoisseur's heart sank. Unfortunately, his comrade's attack was not fatal. The freak growled in anger and pain at the same time. Russell managed to get a piece of his opponent's body, but the injury was not serious. The guy, of course, blamed himself for the unsuccessful jump, but had already regrouped for the next attempt. The second round started the same way as the first. The boy rushed forward, avoiding collision with the demon's magic. To top it all off, the enemy was now acting more cunningly and began to maneuver. The only positive thing was that the wounds were not superficial and healed slowly. Bruce's affairs were not progressing so well, but it was good that his comrades were safe. Indeed, at that moment, they were the ones who were most worried about Russell's fate. The confidence of this eccentric, even in such a difficult moment, delighted those around him. He once again rushed towards danger, casting aside any doubts about defeat. At that moment, Speed remembered one of the conversations at the general meeting about the desire to meet the hero. He was burning with this dream and hoped to find a person among his students who would meet these criteria. At this time, he believed everyone around him except Russell. Charlotte, whom he considered to be unusually talented. Without a doubt, Bruce, on whom I had placed my main hopes. But the strange freshman did not inspire such feelings in the guy at all. And the knife master himself did not strive to take the place of the powers that be, because this would change the future. But this dangerous situation changed Speed's views radically. Meanwhile, the mermaid decided to try another magical trick. She released a school of energy fish towards the enemy. Each of them floated along its own trajectory, which made maneuvering difficult. Russell tried his best to avoid the collision. He realized that he was moving too slowly. The opponent was incredibly happy because she had come up with another trick. Suddenly, a portal formed under the guy's feet, through which schools of fish also flew. He took off running, thinking up a new strategy along the way. Since he was running in the opposite direction from his opponent, she relaxed completely. The mermaid decided that she was gaining an advantage and needed to consolidate the result. Unexpectedly for everyone, the demoness turned towards Speed. Charlotte was the first to notice it. It turns out that all this time the villain was focused on destroying the healer. The guy with the flute was dumbfounded. That was exactly his defensive reaction. He was already saying goodbye to life when suddenly Russell appeared next to the mermaid and cut off her hand. While this did not eliminate the powerful enemy, it did delay the attack on the rest of the team. The freak was really surprised that this happened. He didn't expect the hero to be so fast. The magic spell worked, but the cut-off end was not aimed at the intended place. The energy beam finally hit the cave wall and illuminated everything for several kilometers around. And after that, the author of Hellish Magic himself got it. This moment was recorded by other teams of students who were in this sector. Of course, they had no idea what was going on there, but they became interested in the curiosity. The unexpected rain made the girls think that it was lightning. They themselves still had a lot of work to do. They needed to save the wounded. With so much damage, there was no point in continuing the fight. Their test was over. At this time, Bruce's team continued to work. Everyone remained in their places. Which couldn't be said about the half-fish. Charlotte noticed with surprise that the sea monsters began to run away. The cave was gradually cleared of monsters. But by itself, having lost its integrity, it began to rapidly collapse. Unlike other creatures, the mermaid had no intention of running away. In principle, Russell did not expect such steps from her. He did not manage to seriously harm his opponent. This time, the demoness simply went berserk. It seemed that she had completely lost control of herself. With the sea monsters no longer a threat to safety, Russell ordered Charlotte to protect the crew. Speed continued to treat Bruce, watching events unfold with tension. The knife master has 10 seconds of painlessness left. The countdown has begun. This time was set aside for the final maneuver. Now the guy had no right to make a mistake. He rushed forward with the firm intention of ending the threat. While the rest of her comrades were fighting for their survival, Chloe was doing her job. She ran at top speed because she couldn't break Russell's trust in her. The girl's body was burning with fire. All her muscles ached from the tension. But that was no reason to give up. Now her team members needed help more than ever, and she was their last hope. Although she believed in the boy's abilities, Chloe still knew that he did not enjoy fighting. And if Russell had already decided to engage in combat with the mermaid, it was because they had no other choice. Because she knew him so well, the girl agreed to leave the group. The cave explosion caught her halfway to the portal. Chloe's heart sank with emotion, but she didn't slow down. Holding back her tears, she ran even faster, hoping that her comrades were okay. The rain that started soon made the situation worse. The ground simply began to flow under my feet, and it became increasingly difficult to run. She no longer thought about the portal. Someone would have arranged for a representative of the Auditor clan. In a moment of despair, the girl suddenly saw something strange ahead. Because of the fast running, everything was blurry before my eyes, but there was almost no doubt. A few meters away from her, sea monsters gathered. It was a completely unfortunate moment for another battle. With no choice, Chloe took up her sword and charged. To her surprise, the first blow was blocked by a person. It was one of the first-year students. Russell's envoy breathed a sigh of relief and immediately began to ask for forgiveness, after which she fell to the ground without strength. Around her, there were a lot of wounded and killed monsters. Those who still showed signs of life were mercilessly eliminated. Annabelle, who was the captain of this team, was trying to understand what happened to Russell's friend. She remembered the girl within seconds of seeing her. Chloe didn't have the strength to get up and couldn't even put two words together. While the runner was trying to pull herself together a few kilometers away, the situation in the cave was getting worse. Speed couldn't take his eyes off Russell's skillful movements. The defender acted quickly and decisively, professionally assessing the opponent's weaknesses. It was a fascinating spectacle, and the healer tried not to lose a second, to keep everything in his memory. The young man was sure that such skill required years of study, and he was not mistaken. Everything that Wesley had been able to take from his teacher over the years, he was now putting into practice. This time the mermaid was unable to avoid fatal damage. Cut into pieces, she fell before the eyes of astonished onlookers. None of the students had ever seen such a fight with their own eyes. They were so stunned that they did not immediately realize that they were being attacked. Charlotte rushed forward to protect Speed because the boy was focused on something else. They rolled a meter to the side, avoiding the energy beam. A powerful blow pierced the rock behind them. Concentrating on their brother's skill with knives, they forgot about magic. Even on the verge of losing, the mermaid still tried to kill the healer. It took Russell time to remove the threat. Despite being seriously wounded, the demoness prepared to attack again. She used a hurricane of needles against her impudent opponent, hoping that this time he won't be able to escape death. It was necessary to move to a safe place immediately. The freshman began to maneuver. Some of the needles were redirected into one of the walls of the cave. The power of their energy caused even the blade of the sashimi knife to melt. Making an incredible turn in the air, Russell began to rapidly approach the enemy. The mermaid didn't even have time to bat an eye before the guy's knife hit her body. The pain was unbearable, as evidenced by her screams. But the villain managed to save some energy for revenge. Right in front of the astonished students, she tore out her tongue. Instead, an energy field began to form inside the demoness's mouth. A moment later, she opened her giant mouth and directed this stream in the direction of the enemy. Speed and Charlotte's mouths dropped open in surprise, screaming for their comrade to run away immediately. Russell himself saw perfectly well that he needed to maneuver, but for some reason his body did not obey. Suddenly he found himself in a different place. The guy was standing in the water. The knife master slowly looked around but saw nothing. There was nothing but sparkling blue water everywhere. And when he touched her, a red beam illuminated the horizon. It was as if he had cut the world in half without causing Russell any harm. The young man felt that this was a hint. He didn't need to run away, he needed to cut. Coming out of a kind of coma, the knife master grabbed his weapon more comfortably. He jumped into the air and took a more advantageous position. It was a counterattack. Two fierce opponents met in a final blow. It was all over in an instant. The magic cut through by a regular sashimi knife bought at a discount. The sounds of the struggle died down, leaving only the sound of rain penetrating the cave. The mermaid's mangled body lay on the ground. Russell was still standing over her head, holding the gun in his hands, catching his breath. The guy expected some surprises. Everything couldn't end so simply. And then, as if from the very depths of the demoness, her moans were heard. Charlotte and Speed also tensed up, which meant that evil was not yet defeated. And indeed, a second later, all that remained of the monster's face began to move. The head and part of the chest rolled into the abyss. The mermaid decided to run away. The demon was definitely not going to fight, which meant Russell had won this confrontation. It was an unheard-of event in the world of academy. A first-year student overcame a mermaid on his own. But it was not without injuries. While cutting his opponent's magic, Russell himself received serious injuries. When the boy fell to his knees, Charlotte was the first to rush to his aid. Speed, meanwhile, assessed the condition of Bruce, who, thank the gods, was already feeling much better. Suddenly, the healer heard a stomp behind him. It could have been anyone. Even the sea monsters could return, and it was impossible to forget about the danger. Looking back, the guy saw Annabelle and her group carrying Chloe on their shoulders. Even though they weren't teachers, those present still felt relieved that they weren't themselves. The new arrivals looked around in surprise. Only Annabelle looked at Russell. Fragments of the mermaid's body scattered everywhere indicated a fierce battle. No one could understand how this could happen. All students were promised the absence of demons. Charlotte, meanwhile, tried to bring the knife master to his senses. She was in a state of shock. Even Bruce and Annabelle noticed the girl's overly provocative manners. The granddaughter of Keith Nibelung, to be honest, did not quite understand the behavior of the leader of the competitors. He was too mannered and did not care at all about the fate of the team member, so she took the initiative. The girl contacted the teachers and asked for help. All that was left was to wait and find out what happened here. Speed took it upon himself to explain the latest events. He said everything that had been boiling over regarding the appearance of the demon. He was overcome with natural dissatisfaction with the promises of the Academy's leadership. They found themselves in mortal danger due to the negligence of their instructors. After listening to her classmates' report, Annabelle didn't believe it at first. It was hard to imagine that Russell could deal with such a freak on his own. The girl perceived this fact as a partial invention of Speed, associated with excessive stress. On the other hand, there was no reason not to believe the version that was voiced, just as there was no reason to lie. The whole picture, which could be assessed with one's own eyes, testified to the fact that a deadly fight had taken place. Annabelle found it difficult to make independent judgments that were not based on the experience and status of her family. She tried her best to separate her personal achievements from the expectations of her relatives, but she still couldn't believe that the young man who was now lying on the ground was capable of such skill. If what Speed said really happened, there's a huge gap between Russell's power and his. After all, one could pick around inside oneself forever. The immediate problem was the guy's injury. Team healer Annabelle rushed to heal the freshman. As she watched the knife master's wounds heal, Annabelle wondered who she was really watching. Speed's voice interrupted her thoughts, asking if the girl had called for help from the academy. After thinking about what had happened for a while, the guy was against disclosing all the details of the battle. From the teacher's point of view, the island was a place for holding examinations, and the appearance of a mermaid in this particular cave, along the path of their group, could not have been accidental. One could ponder forever the variations of this potential tragedy and their causes. But finding out the real reasons had to be done using slightly different methods. Bruce was the first to realize what Speed was getting at. There was a traitor at Joaquin's academy. When this phrase left the mouth of the team captain, the cave became quiet. Eventually, the healer agreed with his point of view, although he did not want it to be true. If it weren't for Russell's abilities and courage, there would be nothing left of Bruce's group. This incident could be evidence of a new conflict or even the beginning of a major war. When Annabelle realized the full depth of this thought, her first feeling was fear. It could be that they are the last generation that knows what a peaceful existence is. The assembled group made it an unspoken rule to keep their suspicions secret. It was necessary to come up with a legend for the teachers. No one should know about Russell's achievements. A collective conspiracy was brewing. But no one dared to suggest any solution to the problem. Unexpectedly, Annabelle suggested contacting Keith Nibelung. The Sword Emperor was bound to be on their side and had more influence over the senior contingent in the academy. Several days later, in the school's infirmary, Russell began to come to his senses. He did not understand where he was and what had happened to him, but gradually his memory began to return. After all the events that lay in wait for him, he was surprised that he remained alive. This horrific attack was unavoidable, and he knew he was potentially going to his death. If it weren't for the intuition that materialized out of nowhere, the guy would have died without ever understanding the way out. He tore the magic in half with a simple knife and turned it into ordinary water. He remembered the feeling of extreme power at that moment. The guy wanted to immediately look at his indicators. Most likely, changes were expected there. Finally, the spirit level, which he had not been able to pump up until now, rose by 4 notches. And the adaptation has progressed even further. Now, it has additional properties. The analysis of new skills and upgrades was interrupted by the appearance of Paige Poison. The principal pounced on the astonished first-year student with hugs. It seemed like the woman was genuinely worried about the guy. The director promised to deal with everyone who put him in danger. Suddenly, she released his suffocating embrace because she remembered the small change she had brought with her. From the spatial pocket, she soon took out something that the young man did not expect to see now. It was that very Murasame sword that was the crowning glory of everything Russell wanted to get from this exam. This weapon was originally rated B, but had the potential to be upgraded. The director apologized for the fact that the award ceremony took place unofficially. She was the first to notice the presence of another person behind the door. Of course, the woman understood who it could be and insistently invited him inside. Just like last time, Keith Nibelung and Paige Poison ended up in Russell's room. The guy looked at the visitors silently, just like the first time, shocked by their presence. He couldn't shake the feeling of a strange déjà vu. Would every injury from now on really have such consequences? The principal explained that they had become aware of what had actually happened during the exams. The elders really felt sorry and wanted to apologize from the bottom of their hearts for such a terrible mistake. The threat to the lives of the students was entirely the responsibility of the academy, and the reasons must be investigated. Russell was stunned by such frankness and did not know what to answer. In turn, the director promised to find all the culprits and traitors so that this would not happen again. The cat, after remaining silent, finally said that the freshman had bravely saved people. The young man himself did not consider this something surprising. He could not have acted otherwise. All those gathered agreed that what happened should be kept secret. Russell himself was of the same opinion. He did not want to gain popularity and draw attention to himself. And in this conversation, Paige Poison was amazed at the freshmen's resourcefulness. Having told each other everything that was planned, the delegation of visitors said goodbye. And although in front of Russell's eyes both elders tried to control themselves, after leaving the room they immediately plunged into depressing thoughts. The director decided to have a frank talk with her old friend. She named their first meeting at the academy several decades ago. Back then they had completely different ideas about the world and their own capabilities. For more than 50 years, the man and woman dedicated themselves to working for the benefit of the Joaquin Academy. A lot has changed during this time, but neither Keith nor Paige managed to make a significant contribution through their own victories. Until yesterday, they managed to set up a powerful system of protection for the educational institution. However, everything changed with the student's final test, and this incredibly angered the director. She did not notice that she activated her power because of her own anger. An aura of rage and tension spread through the corridor and engulfed even the strongest man of the present. She felt responsible for this disaster, which was miraculously avoided. For it was Paige who made the final decision regarding the island's safety. As it seemed to the woman, she paid maximum attention to the possible presence of mermaids. But still, this turned out to be not enough. A moment later, the tension around them disappeared due to the fact that Keith managed to bring his friend out of her thoughtful state. Indeed, Russell's appearance among the students of the educational institution can be considered a happy accident. This guy certainly had a natural talent that he had demonstrated on numerous occasions. During his life, the cat observed many names that appeared in the heroic firmament, but they disappeared. That is why he never assured Annabelle of her exclusivity. The girl had to work tirelessly. With regard to Russell, Cott had a completely different opinion. The man believed that the young man was a genius of his time. It was a huge chance not only for the student, but also for the swordmaster himself, a development for both. Having made a final decision on some issues about the future, the swordsman headed towards the exit. The fact that the academy owed the guy a huge debt remained obvious and indisputable. It's time to move on and work on strengthening the school's defenses. The elders decided to leave the past in the past and to closely monitor that such things do not happen again. When Russell's health improved, he finally began attending classes. This time the director's word was backed up by action. No one knew what exactly happened in the cave. Therefore, the guy felt free and decided to start improving the weapon. He ordered a reinforcement for Murasami from the best blacksmith, and he willingly accepted the order. The young man managed to contact the workshop on the academy's founding day, so the work was free. This took another big burden off the shoulders of the poor student. All that was left was to wait for the upgrade. Chloe later came to the class and was also injured during the test. It turned out that she had a broken leg, but this did not hinder her good mood. She said that she was given medical assistance and promised a speedy recovery. The genetics of the Auditor clan also had its advantages. The quick healing of wounds was the pride of the clan representatives. Russell was genuinely happy to see his friend. To be honest, he was worried about her fate, because he understood that without teamwork, defeating the mermaid would not have happened. Each member of the group conscientiously fulfilled the role assigned to him. To be honest, everyone except Bruce, on whom the guy had placed more hope. The hero of this game did not show himself in any way during the danger, and this was alarming, despite his injury. The conversations in the audience were interrupted by the appearance of the chief instructor, who ordered everyone to take their seats. As always, the man was extremely aggressive, but today he had an important announcement. He announced that from today onwards, he would be co-leading the dragon class with an important person. When Keith Nibelung entered the classroom, all the students probably forgot how to breathe. The man paid no attention to this reaction and quickly headed towards the podium. Even the instructor bowed his head respectfully to the Sword Emperor. The respect was absolute. Only Russell understood that this event was directly related to his unexpected achievements. By evening, while the search for traitors in the academy had not yet found any support, they could meet without arousing suspicion or risk. But the reason for the next meeting did not have a positive connotation. The assistant to the chief instructor of the dragon class was knocking the life out of her protege. Kimberly punished the man for failing the task. She had no other choice because the commander of the 5th Demon Army did not get the desired result. Failure to fulfill assigned duties in the organization was punished very severely. Therefore, despite numerous requests for clemency, the man was subjected to severe beatings. Kimberly couldn't understand why the seasoned warrior couldn't bring a freshman with him. Bruce, although now considered the strongest student in the academy, did not pose such a threat. Since the plan had failed and traitors were most likely being sought, the situation worsened. Now it will only be more difficult to spy on students and carry out any actions. Each time the thought of it made Kimberly even more furious, while her, so to speak, interlocutor was recovering from the terrible beating. The girl finally began to tidy herself up. She cleaned her clothes from bloodstains. She was surprised not only by the sluggishness of her subordinate, but also by the sudden amazing abilities of the first-year students. While the instructor was loudly discussing this with herself, the man finally found his voice. He said that the reason for the failure was not Bruce, but a guy on his team named Russell. This name stopped the woman who was about to leave. The hunt for hero candidates became more and more interesting with each passing hour. The next morning at the academy began, as always, with hellish training. The instructor drove the first-year students in circles, not giving them time to catch their breath. and only Chloe was entitled to rest due to her broken leg. He hated physical exercise, didn't hide it, and envied his girlfriend. Keith Nibelung also didn't let the guy forget about training. The man took direct part in the classes, running alongside other students, which incredibly bothered the guy, who was already suffering from pressure from the head instructor. This man was definitely considered the strongest warrior who inherited the legendary title. But in the game, in the Second Great War, he is supposed to be Bruce's mentor. Now the presence of the dragon in the class was evidence that the course of history here had begun to change. Russell wondered if he had become a new subject for curation. Although probably this will not change anything, because Bruce never received the title of swordsman for a while. On the other hand, it was an incredible experience. A truly legendary figure wasted his time on ordinary freshmen. The cat did not let the young man out of his sight. He put it into his head. Talent without physical training is nothing. But he encouraged Russell to work hard on himself. Surprisingly, his confidence in the boy's abilities prompted him to work with concentration. But no matter how hard the freshman tried, it was difficult for him to even stay close to his mentor. This seemingly ancient grandfather gave many young men a head start, which caused delight and irritation at the same time. When the runs were over, it was time for a new announcement. The cat announced that from today onwards, students are prohibited from using their personal weapons. Instead, he suggested paying attention to one of the following. The instructors tried to select the closest possible options to ensure successful adaptation. Russell noticed with amazement that among the indicated ones, it was already so close to him than for sashimi. Not everyone liked this proposal from the world's strongest man. One of the students from the star class believed that it was unethical to deprive him of his family weapon, but the cat willingly became his opponent in this matter. He advocated for a reliable basic skill. The main thing was always skill, and then an artifact that helps in battle. The young man did not back down and insisted that this approach would negate the old familiar methods of struggle. In this case, the world's strongest man decided to respond with a quote from Master Russell. Indeed, true warriors never blamed weapons for their losses. And Wesley had learned this many years ago, in his previous life in the kitchen. To encourage a quick transition to the new weapon, the cat promised the most successful ones a good score on the exam. This worked best. The students rushed to choose artifacts in front of each other. Only Russell remained standing. He was in no hurry, realizing that no one would choose him. This was quite expected. Why would anyone need something for sashimi when they have axes and swords? When he picked up the chosen object from the ground, he noticed Keith's gaze. Of course, this man won't leave him alone so easily. Now he has his sights set on Russell. After the election was decided, it was time for the trial by combat. This news confused those gathered. They had not yet fought for real, without subspace. But students must definitely get this experience, because in reality they will not have the right to make mistakes. The only difference from real battlefield conditions was that etiquette had to be observed. The cat announced that he would first conduct a demonstration duel, and the instructor prepared for the confrontation. His hands trembled at the thought of having to withstand the blows of such a formidable warrior. But, to his surprise and perhaps happiness, the strongest man in the world chose a different opponent. The opponent was supposed to be a student, and none other than Russell. The cat ordered the young man to come forward immediately. When the mentor pulled out his sword, everyone held their breath in amazement. It was a noble spectacle, striking in its grandeur. But no one understood the reasons for Kita's strange choice of Nibelung. The students from the star class were the loudest in their dissatisfaction. They did not think about Russell's feelings. But this didn't bother the nimble grandfather at all. He was eager to start the fight. But he prompted the guy to take the knife out of its sheath. Russell, of course, managed to recover, but considered such proposals to be beyond the pale. There was a big difference between a sword and a knife, and this fight could have become much more difficult or ended in injuries. Despite these circumstances, something inside the guy wanted his consent. He strove for it. But no matter how this confrontation ends, after such extra attention there is no way to avoid it. So, using safe logic, Russell tried to refuse the offer. This was perceived by those around him as further proof of the guy's weakness. But that's exactly what he achieved. The cat did not want to listen to fables. He called upon the pride of the capable warrior who hid his strength. Pride is the feeling Wesley experienced for decades after reaching the peak of his skill. The fact that he was proud of his abilities and many years of work made him maintain his reputation. Russell realized that this was the point of no return. And in front of everyone, the young man had to make a decisive choice. Contrary to logic, the guy squeezed the tighter in his hands. The instructor, who realized the absurdity of the situation and was in a hurry to change Keith's decision, was stopped. The world's strongest man sensed the change in his opponent's behavior, and he decided that there was no need for more conversation. After a theatrical pause, so to speak, Russell announced that he was ready for any experiments. Having activated the sword's blessing, the young man took a comfortable position to begin the duel. Suddenly, everyone around disappeared. Only two remained: the Nibelung cat and the knife master. But now there was no time to pay attention to this. The young man slowly walked forward. He was in no hurry to attack because he saw that his opponent had not participated in sparring for a long time. In the first seconds, the motor grandfather actually mentioned his initial experience in wielding a sword. During this time, at a young age, he met a wandering knight who taught him fighting techniques. At this time, the man felt for the first time something that is difficult to describe in words. When you're up against a gifted individual, you always learn more than you could ever gain through years of hard work. Now, at this moment, the same feelings have taken possession of the heart of the strongest man in the world. And thanks to such moments, the cat himself will be able to grow professionally. The husband assumed a stance that signaled his readiness to begin. At that very moment, Russell rushed forward and instantly bypassed his opponent from the side. The mentor had to admit that he had created a false impression of the young man. He was much faster. The sword seemed like a rather clumsy weapon in such a situation. The freshman had no intention of stopping for a moment, for every delay could cost injuries. And although they did not fight on equal terms in relation to weapons, the knife master found the optimal approach for himself. He did not waste time dodging his opponent's attack, but on the contrary, ran towards danger. When Keith managed to catch the guy halfway, he deftly flipped the knife from one hand to the other. The fact that the young man was ambidextrous also increased his danger to the enemy, and the guy's physical skills have improved significantly since the first test. Keith was left to rely only on the strength of his sword, as opposed to the lightness and dexterity of the first year. Gradually, the training duel turned into something a little more serious. The students who were supposed to be watching the fight were at a loss. They couldn't believe that Russell was getting the attention he deserved. But the attention of the strongest man in the world indicated that there could be no mistake. If this boy aimed for a hero, the envy of many who wanted glory would immediately stand in his way. But after the start of the fight was announced, the opponents simply stood opposite each other. Nobody said a word and was in no hurry to show off new techniques. Both Keith Nibelung and Russell seemed to have flown into another space. The first person to realize what was happening was the head instructor. The two were not standing still, they were actually fighting, but in the subconscious of the mentor. Even before the announcement of the sparring began, the man warned that he wanted to do it. For some reason, the cat had no doubt that Russell would be able to get there on the first try. Only the chief instructor doubted the feasibility of this idea. And it turns out it was in vain. This testified to the existence of a truly outstanding talent of the first-year student. Meanwhile, things were going a little badly for Nibelung, and his opponent was becoming more and more impressive. He not only took the blow, but also fought fully in the mind of another person, which was very difficult. The guy didn't spend much time learning this ability. It took no more than a minute. This behavior confirmed all the mentor's guesses and hopes. The man wanted to make sure to test the young man's ability to resist the blessing of the sword spirit. This was his crown skill, which gave the warrior extraordinary strength. At the moment of activation, Russell immediately decided to escape to the real world, and everyone felt a jolt of energy. The head instructor saw a blue light, indicating that the fight had reached a new level. The two opponents returned to reality, but still continued their confrontation. Since the cat was not going to stop himself, it had to be done for him. The priority was to save the life of the student, and here the position of the teacher himself was no longer important. Fortunately, Paige Poison arrived before the men, separating the two opponents. She immediately yelled at her longtime friend for his carelessness in decision-making. Later, in her office, the director gave full vent to her feelings. But her ardor was quickly stopped for a moment by the forgiveness of an old friend. Then she still remembered how hard it was to get him to be the curator of this class. And although the man said he had no bad intentions, his actions jeopardized future mentoring, and especially the reputation of Paige Poison herself. The cat himself admitted that he had overdone it a bit. He had lost his vigilance during the fight. As a result, the guy managed to break out of his mind at the most tense moment. The apology from Nibelung was truly something special, because it was never addressed to a woman. Therefore, she was interested in the reason for such behavior, especially since he himself provoked the uncomfortable situation. But his admission that he could have lost the fight without divine protection threw her completely off balance. Paige was well-versed in Keith's powers, so she was extremely impressed by the freshman's potential power. He even reached the level of the way of thinking without any problems and was able to feel free there. And the young man was not yet 30 years old, which testified to his extraordinary abilities. This behavior was evidence of the awakening of the true hero that humanity lacked. Although, even the elders of the establishment found it difficult to believe in such a possibility. Unexpectedly, the director remembered her first impressions after she stopped the fight. There was a feeling of a powerful dark energy building up around the guy. And as a result, the woman was overcome with unspeakable horror. She remembered experiencing something similar during her meeting with the commander of the 6th Legion, Basman. Today, she attributed her impression to the Korean transcription of the boy's name, which mentioned a demon. Regarding the events in Keith's subconscious, The woman did not feel even a shadow of a lie. And why would there be a lie? This meant that if the opponents had not been stopped, the world's strongest man would have lost the fight. This remark outraged the interlocutor the most. He began to come up with all sorts of excuses for himself, which greatly amused the headmistress, who immediately remembered all of Nibelung's teachings over the years. It was obvious that the elderly hero did not like the appearance of talented young blood. He did not want to give up his position, so the argument continued until late at night. Before dawn, Russell woke up from a dream about a fight with Keith. This restless grandfather did not leave his thoughts even at night, and although analyzing what happened, one could breathe a sigh of relief. This sparring was aggressive and had a high risk of injury to any of the participants. Of course, yesterday the guy immediately realized that he had fallen into this way of thinking. It was the first time he found himself in such a state. Although he had read about it before, it was strange. For only masters who had practiced with the same weapon for many years were capable of this. In general, in this world, only 10 people could enter this state. Bruce, for example, only learned these abilities after 3 years of training under the Nibelung. Russell, on the other hand, had to thank his past life in Wesley's body. For 20 years, he was considered a master of knives and practiced his mastery of such an artifact. It seemed as if the chef was there for a reason. Both the man's previous and current lives complemented each other. With each new obstacle, everything pointed to a symbiosis of two parallel universes. Therefore, there was no need to avoid dangers from today on. Russell decided to focus on solving problems one step at a time. Moreover, he was fascinated by the idea of experiencing the transition to the space of thoughts. There was no point in delaying it, because it would make his training easier, which was accompanied by incredible pain. The next dive took place just a few seconds later. Everything turned out to be much simpler than it seemed at first. And indeed, here the blade of the sashimi knife did not cause the guy any inconvenience. But if there were advantages, there were also disadvantages to be expected. The space began to burst at the seams within a minute. A giant hand of some creature reached inside. She touched the boy's shoulder and activated the blade's power. When Russell opened his eyes, his surprise knew no bounds. The sashimi knife in his hands simply disappeared into thin air. Leaving the space of opinions did not solve this problem. Weapons no longer existed. Under cover of night, a secret meeting was taking place in one of the academy buildings. Those gathered proclaimed their dissatisfaction with Kimberly's actions. The elders felt that allowing the mermaid to attack the students was going too far. But whatever one may say, it helped to reveal Russell's extraordinary talent, even though Bruce was the target. The latter was also not worth forgetting against the backdrop of alarming news. He could still show great progress. It was also unnerving that Page Poison seemed to be hiding the true powers of a special student. As the threats grew, it was necessary to take care of all possible candidates. The elders wanted to seize more power in the academy because their powers were being cut back every year. This did not suit anyone except the director, so they found new allies. The hero who was supposed to appear soon could completely ruin the conspirators' many years of work. At the meeting, it was decided to create as many obstacles as possible in the path of becoming strong students. Such was Kimberly's will, but no one had the courage to go against the woman's wishes. The commander of the 5th Demon Legion was not a being that could be ignored. When the topic of all the concerns was finally discussed, a decision was made. Russell was assigned to be eliminated by representatives of the Auditor family. In the morning, the unsuspecting young man went to the forge for his renewed weapon, but he did not expect to see what would outrage him almost to the point of madness. From a very beautiful sword, the best blacksmith of the academy created another version of a sashimi knife. In addition to this, the weapon characteristics have risen far from the maximum level. The freshman gritted his teeth in rage. He couldn't understand how this had happened. The blacksmith himself assured the young man that this was the first time he had experienced this. No matter how much he tried to upgrade the sword, it refused to give in. Therefore, in order not to break the blade completely, it had to be urgently melted down. The man kept assuring the customer that he did not do it intentionally. But Russell was focused on assessing the damage, and no matter how he looked at it, he didn't get what he wanted. Koval promised to complete the work he had started for free, but asked only for materials for this. The first-year student was even afraid to trust the master to continue the work. Moreover, in order to obtain the necessary materials, it is necessary to defeat Class A monsters or higher. This meant accepting high risks with poor weapons in hand. Having thought it over in more detail, the guy came up with an interesting scheme for making real money. But he demanded from the blacksmith a guarantee that the work would be completed in the required volume. In addition, he wanted compensation for the damage in the amount of half of the lost blade, namely 10 million. The man immediately began to deny such a possibility, citing the fact that the work was being done for free. But the young man decided that this was completely impudent, so he reminded her that the constipation was good source material. And to add weight to his own indignation, the sly man began to threaten reprisals for deception. So the bargaining began. With half the amount that the interlocutor insisted on, they gradually moved up to 800,000. The trickster insisted that it would be impossible to find that much money right now. But the menacing appearance of the first-year student, around whom an ominous aura formed, did its job. The master, sweating from horror, agreed to all the conditions if only the visitor would leave. Even though everything didn't go as planned, there was progress in the indicators. Russell even had additional options opened up with the upgrade. It was now clear that due to the appearance of the necessary weapon, the pain from the sword's blessing was reduced. The young man immediately checked the accuracy of these new indicators and was convinced that it was true. In order to get a more tolerable effect, it was necessary to improve the sword as much as possible. This would make being in this game world less stressful than usual. Come to think of it, Wesley still couldn't figure out how he got here, but whose business was it? The evening meal was interrupted by the appearance of Chloe. The girl, even with crutches, moved like a cat. It turns out that they managed to remove her cast this afternoon, and now all that remains is recovery. She assured her friend that she felt much better. Russell liked the positive mood of his interlocutor, and she, lost in her dreams from the guy's usual touches, lost her balance. She fell to the ground, prudently stretching out her sore leg. The freshman immediately rushed to her aid and accidentally showed her his new weapon. And although the knife still looked bad, she began to praise the master's work. Chloe seemed to really like the upgraded artifact. But Russell himself does not support this idea. He expected more. The only thing that consoled him now was the compensation he received from the blacksmith. The next adventures and victories over monsters were supposed to provide a real upgrade. This whole chase was only due to the fact that he was tired of enduring pain. At the same time, the guy wanted to return the Murasame sword to its original appearance, because what he saw now drove the young man into depression. Chloe, sensing her interlocutor's sadness, suddenly went from friendliness to anger. She sought to punish the scoundrel for his poor performance and attempt to cheat her crush. As always, the girl was brought back to consciousness by Russell's touch, suddenly looking back, as if there was someone else nearby. The identity of the spy needed to be determined, so the freshman decided not to delay. Approaching a nearby tree, he began to shake its trunk. And indeed, a minute later, David Auditor landed on the ground. Russell didn't know what exactly to expect from the guy, so he prepared himself for another fight. He, in turn, jumped to his feet. Only Chloe looked from one young man to the other in amazement. She calmed her friend down as best she could and offered to listen to her brother. Since David didn't look like a man who wanted to kill anyone right now, it was an acceptable offer. He wanted to share urgent information, and he was dragging his feet because for the first time he decided to go against the will of his family. When the knife master began to complain about his indecisiveness, David looked around and finally began to speak. The Hope of the Auditor clan declared that he was doing this only for the well-being of his sister, because Chloe really valued her friendship with her interlocutor, and the news related specifically to its integrity and safety. David informed the assembled group that an order had been received from the Council of Elders for a knife maker. At first, this information seemed like some kind of surrealism, but Chloe took this statement as the beginning of the hunt. She could not allow such tyranny on the part of her brother. Therefore, she immediately took up arms, preparing to repel the attack. The red-haired beast was so frightened that it took a while for him to realize that David was in no hurry to attack. It was more important for the guy to explain that such an order was taken very seriously by the Auditor family. The only hope was that the director knew about this and the order would be cancelled, because it was against the rules, but if nothing changed, someone would have to fulfill the order. David came here with the best intentions. The boy and girl needed to know the truth. Russell liked what he saw in his interlocutor. It was a testament to his humanity and sudden socialization that touched the knife master. That's why the freshman wanted to apologize for his behavior earlier. But the interlocutor did not need this. The most important thing to him was Chloe's happiness, and he was ready to do everything for this. He wanted only one thing, for the guy to behave with dignity and protect what was entrusted to him. This confused Russell a little, but he agreed to this step under the close gaze of his opponent. The auditor was interested in one more thing. He wanted to understand how the first-year student had managed to develop his abilities so much. When this question was asked out loud, the knife master tensed up. It was suspicious due to the characteristics of the divine blessing skill. Therefore, such curiosity looked like a reason to play a double game. Russell had no intention of answering provocative questions. He decided to do him a favor. The guy said that David needed to be more open. Therefore, he will have more support and his status will increase within the walls of the academy. Having said everything he wanted, the young man turned around and left, despite the objections. History lessons were still boring. Therefore, the young man spent this time thinking about ordering his death. It was necessary to urgently remember which family's representatives took part in the Council of Elders. These were 5 dishonest people, burdened with power, who exerted influence and hindered the forces of good. Previously, according to history, They chose Bruce as their opponent. Now their target has become Russell. This imposed many problems on the future existence of the Academy. The order had to be cancelled. This is what the consequences of using your abilities to the maximum looked like. It attracted attention. If, on the one hand, everything that was happening was difficult to believe, on the other hand, recent events gave rise to bad thoughts. The Council of Elders had already begun its dirty game. At first, their target was Bruce. Indeed, everything was like in the game, but his intervention changed the course of history. Paige Poison's powers were not unlimited. She could not protect Russell from all threats. Of course, that's why the information quickly leaked to the highest levels of power at the Joaquin Academy. One could only guess whether these scoundrels had conspired with the demons, or were still acting independently. The appearance of the mermaid during the exam indicated that the second option was unlikely. It is obvious that the situation for humanity was rapidly deteriorating due to the thirst of individual representatives. It was not the time to kill all the bastards yet, but this moment was bound to happen someday. According to his reflections, Russell could not concentrate on the lecture at all, and the teacher insisted on taking notes. It was necessary to develop a detailed plan of subsequent actions, literally step by step. But without a team, it was difficult and took a long time to move forward. Now Chloe was 100% willing to give in for him, and perhaps Charlotte too, if you asked her. The third candidate was a healer. Speed Weapon was better suited for this. He decided to talk to the young man immediately after the lecture. There, Russell was in for an unpleasant surprise. Some giant was asking for trouble. And although the Knife Master did not want to get into unnecessary conflicts, he was ready to put a clear, impudent person in his place, if absolutely necessary. As soon as the words left the guy's mouth, his opponent immediately rushed into attack. But the giant's reaction was too slow compared to his opponent. Just as Russell was about to fight back, Speed's fist hit the bully in the face. Students from one of the boys' classes, hearing the sounds of the fight, began to gather around. Although it was hard to call it a real brawl, the giant was already lying on the floor. This was Russell's first experience watching a healer fight, and the guy really had a talent for it. Speed immediately realized that the Knife Master was looking for him and was ready to talk. After hearing the plan, the guy immediately gave his consent. The conditions were more than acceptable. Russell's main condition was that the formation of the squad would be handled by a healer. The team needed 4 people. The rules of the Academy allowed them to go on a mission only in this way. If it weren't for this condition, according to Speed, his comrade would have managed on his own. Although the Knife Master himself modestly objected to this, not wanting to become public knowledge. Surprisingly, the guys who initially didn't like each other were now able to be sincere friends. At one point, Russell even thought that this could be a good start for a real friendship. The dungeon for the test had already been selected in advance. It was called Buffalo and had a C class. It was a popular place among the locals, so there shouldn't be any problems with those who want to go. There were already 3 people in the group now. It remains to choose the last one. Neither Bruce nor Charlotte were approved by the Knife Master. According to Speed, it was impossible to do this at all because both students were busy with their own affairs. After thinking it over for a bit, the healer suggested another candidate. According to him, it was clear that this was a girl and one could not approach her empty-handed. When it was already late evening, the comrades came to visit. This was the first time Russell had seen a separate estate on the Joaquin Academy grounds. He didn't even have that kind of experience in the game. Judging by everything that surrounded them, there was always someone conscientiously training on the territory. After walking around the building a bit, Speed finally saw the man he was looking for. He walked up to the sleeping girl and shouted for her to wake up. But no matter how hard he tried, all attempts were in vain. The stranger was having her 10th dream. Only the information that the young man bought her favorite snack made an impression on the beauty. She came to her senses immediately, like a cat whose nose was waved with a shrimp. Since Russell had the treats in his hands, Annabelle rushed towards him. Her dexterity even made the Knife Master lose his balance. The girl was like a meteor. She was eating a snack while lying right on top of the guy she had knocked down. And before Russell had time to come to his senses, she was already asking for an extra portion. It was impossible to resist that cute little face. When he was a chef, the routine became so overwhelming for the man that he needed to find an outlet. And the game, Extreme Blessing M, became such a nice place to run to. He had been expecting this application to open since the first announcements. And when I loaded it, this exciting universe immediately absorbed all my attention. The most important character for Wesley was, of course, Annabelle von Nibelung. It was this girl who delighted his affection and wallet. According to the script, Bruce was the center of the academy, with many female fans and assistants of the opposite sex. But among all of them, it was Annabelle who stood out for her popularity and strength. The heroine had charisma, which added a special flavor to every adventure that the boy and girl overcame together. It was a pleasure to watch them. So much so that Wesley, at one time, emptied his wallet for the sake of leveling up characters. Subsequently, he completely forgot that there was another girl in this universe. It was only today, when he saw Ashley's face, that the knife master finally remembered her name. She was the daughter of a saint with a bow, and it was this student that Wesley pumped first. Now, in Russell's body, he understood Speed's choice perfectly when he played with the girl's avatar. Despite her peculiar mind, so to speak, Ashley had good skills in fighting from a distance. She was not part of the main cast of characters, so she had no influence on the history of this world. At least, that's what the student thought. Overall, he was satisfied with his friend's choice. It was time to come to an agreement, and the conversation turned serious. Ashley demanded an explanation for the unexpected nighttime invasion of her home. Speed took on the bulk of the work, introducing Russell to a picky young lady. But he said that the guy was gathering his team, and next Sunday would be dedicated to the mission. The speech was rather confused, but the healer basically laid out all the main points of the proposal, which were quite attractive. After finishing her explanation, Ashley's attention turned completely to Russell. She had undoubtedly heard of the special student's victories in the subspace. There was no reason to refuse, especially since there was a good reward at stake. But the girl was irritated by the fact that the unknown newcomer did not ask for her approval and consent. The girl's provocative remarks only served to increase Russell's skepticism about possible cooperation. She demanded excessive attention and fawning. Speed tried to regulate the time, but the owner believed that character had nothing to do with skill. Since it was impossible to tell about all of Russell's victories, the healer asked to take his word for it, and that didn't work either. The other person's opinion had no influence on Ashley. Listening to the meaningless dialogue, the knife master increasingly realized that he did not want a girl on the team. He interrupted the argument between two acquaintances and informed his friend of his verdict. They had to go. The provocative girl immediately stopped all conversations. She realized that the fish had gotten off the hook. Russell was not going to tolerate the antics of the arrogant young lady and humiliate his own dignity. After a moment of silence, he pulled out one of the sashimi knives he always carried with him. The tension grew even more when the guy unsheathed it. While Ashley suspected that she was in for a sneak attack, the guy threw a knife in the direction of the targets. He wasn't looking in that direction at all, but somehow the weapon hit the bullseye. Obviously, after this, the hostess could not claim that the young man was simply lucky. This was a reason to think and draw new conclusions. A moment later, the second knife hit the same place as the first. Russell calmly asked if this was enough proof of skill for his interlocutor. The girl had nothing more to say in response. She acknowledged the visitor's extraordinary abilities. The next day, Ashley was the first to arrive at the cafe for the team meeting. This act did not go unnoticed by the other comrades. After yesterday, she completely changed her attitude towards Russell. One could tell that today she liked him in some way. His behavior resembled flirting. Everyone noticed this, even the knife master. While waiting for the rest of the squad, Ashley managed to coordinate with the academy management. Since this part of the work has already been done, it is time to discuss the details of the mission. The dungeon that Russell chose had its own inhabitants. They were buffaloes, which had a difficulty class of C. These creatures liked not to engage in close combat, but to do everything from a distance. And this complicated the situation for the students. It was necessary to come up with a special tactic. In addition to the above, there was one more detail, no less important. In the dungeon, in the center, there was a door that could not be opened under any circumstances. No one had any confirmed information, but according to rumors, it was extremely dangerous. The data regarding this door was disseminated by the academy as an axiom, so everyone, including Russell, agreed to avoid her like the plague. The decisiveness with which the special student expressed his opinion attracted attention. Team members have new questions about this. Of course, the knife master knew what was there, but he didn't want to tell others about the strong boss. Fortunately, now the interlocutors have managed to convince otherwise. The guy knew that, based on the data he had, this gate could not be opened now. So there was no need to worry about the rest of the team, even for the girl who was constantly eating snacks. From talking to Ashley, Russell didn't pay attention to one little thing. Chloe disliked any girl he showed even the slightest bit of affection towards. But now the young man had no time for this. Someone was definitely watching them closely. It could be another killer from the auditor family, so the knife master was in no hurry to solve the problem. He had to wait for the right moment to understand who exactly had come for his soul. Very soon, the day of the dungeon raid arrived. For Wesley in the avatar body, this area was familiar enough that he could even say he hated it. But it so happened that even in this life, the local landscapes did not let him go. The bus stopped quite unexpectedly in the middle of the road. It turned out that they had reached a checkpoint. In order to pass, a reason with officially certified documents was needed. To be honest, Russell didn't find such methods entirely safe. Additionally, taking into account my own situation with the Order of the Council of Elders, there was still some time left before his destination, so Speed decided to have a snack. As the boy approached the team leader, he realized that he was too preoccupied to eat. Yes, I'm not the only one. Ashley didn't share the positive attitude either. The girl pretended not to care. but in reality she was watching the special student closely. He caused both delight and anxiety at the same time. The archer did not know what exactly he could do. Russell felt her eyes on him and it was a little depressing. He didn't want her to become like Charlotte. Chloe, who had slept well on the bus, was amazed by the views from the hotel parking lot. Russell imagined the entrance to the dungeon to be somewhat different. Everything around resembled a ski resort. The student prepared for intense battles almost from the start, so he stocked up on weapons. At Speed's request, the squad leader happily showed the contents of his bag, which was filled with knives. The collection was truly impressive, and knowing the skill with which the guy wielded them, one got the impression that he was preparing for war. Hiller did not contradict his comrades' views. On the contrary, he took them into account. The squad members did not waste time settling in, but immediately went to the entrance to the dungeon. Soon, a depressing landscape opened up before them. Large, strong gates, several barriers and security. Apparently, the guards were in contact with the checkpoint because they knew that students from the academy were approaching them. Before entering, they had to write their names on a visitor form, a mandatory requirement. No oddities were noticed until Russell wrote his. One of the men started looking at the boy too closely. This pause lasted so long that all the others noticed the strange behavior of their comrade. With the thought that he needed to be more careful, the knife master entered the dungeon with the group. Perhaps one should have expected some grounds other than the obvious dangers. The young man knew that the auditor family could act in different ways, including faking an accident. They had been walking through the semi-dark tunnels for quite some time now. Ashley started whining about being tired. But the real reason for the girl's whining was boredom over the lack of sweet snacks. She literally lived on them like a car lives on fuel. Rummaging through his bag, Russell managed to find some small candy, which was better than nothing. Moreover, Cunning had its own reserves of sweets, which it kept for later. All conversation stopped when Chloe announced the approach of enemies. It was time to divide the responsibilities between the participants. Chloe and Ashley had to be guarded more carefully. The girls must face weaker monsters and save their strength for future fights. Ashley took out her bow and prepared to meet her opponents. This S-rank artifact made it possible to pass such dungeons without any particular difficulties for the group. But judging by the fact that the girl forgot to take care of the equipment, safety was in doubt. When the squad members reached their maximum tension, everything was resolved in an unexpected way. Ashley took out a chocolate bar and, taking a bite, declared that everything was fine. There was no time left for a serious discussion about discipline, because the monsters were already visible in the distance. The students dispersed to their starting positions, and the healer took out his flute. Chloe was the first to choose her opponent. She jumped into the air like a ninja, but drew her sword from its sheath with ease. The first buffalo fell to the ground, screaming loudly, but the rest of the herd continued to run. The girl was not going to stop at one victim. She announced that she would cope with everyone, which was contrary to the previously agreed-upon plan. Speed stopped this chaos and introduced an archer into the game. Ashley drew her bowstring, selecting her potential victims. In just a moment, 3 arrows flew out in the direction of the opponents. By her actions, the girl deprived Chloe of the need to fight further. 3 buffaloes were destroyed in less than 2 seconds. The archer smiled contentedly when she saw her colleague's reaction. During the resulting pause, the student simply continued to chew her snacks in front of her astonished comrades. The girl's methods impressed Russell. Ashley's abilities were almost unmatched in long-range combat. The only bad thing was that she was depriving him of his prey. Buffalo horns were very valuable. Unexpectedly, the first buffalo to fall ended up in the possession of the blue-haired show-off. His movement was so swift that she would not have had time to use her weapon. There was no trace left of Ashley's good mood. For the first time, the girl was actually scared. She covered her head with her hands, relying only on the team's dexterity. And it was not in vain. A moment later, Russell was nearby and eliminated the monster. The young man had an ordinary sashimi knife in his hands, and from a logical point of view, such an effect seemed impossible. Ashley's reaction was typical of anyone who encountered the true mastery of a special student for the first time. But that wasn't as important as the 2 horns that remained from the surviving first monster. Once the fighting in the tunnel stopped, it was time to show some concern. This polite path paved the way to the archer's heart. While the students were solving the obvious problems below, something was happening on the outside as well. Unaware of the latest conspiracy, Russell collected his first trophies. Now there was no need to worry about what to aggravate Murasami with. Ashley, who was slowly recovering from the shock she had experienced, decided to thank her savior. She gave him the most precious thing of all, one of her chocolates, without which she could not imagine life. This was a step to determine true attachment, and everyone appreciated it, even Chloe, who immediately responded in kind. The desire to kill was stopped only by Russell's appeal to the girl. He hastened to remind his friend that she needed to control herself. The whispers and secrets between the two have sparked rumors within the group regarding their relationship. Of course, this was very flattering to Chloe Auditor. But Russell immediately rushed to put an end to all speculation with a categorical refusal. Although it didn't have much effect, Chloe's loving eyes spoke volumes more than any argument could. The natural-born assassin decided to save her crush and successfully change the subject. She was intrigued by the suspicious emptiness of this popular dungeon. It was unusually quiet here today. This became yet another reason for Russell to suspect another conspiracy. Along with the fact that there were no other conquerors around, there were also almost no monsters. Gradually, each group of participants agreed that this was quite strange. The buffaloes that the comrades met on the way also did not give the impression of being angry. They were more likely frightened by something in the middle of the dungeon and ran away from it. And these were truly balanced creatures in the wild. They were even used to cultivate fields, which Russell personally considered perverse. But as long as the connection with the surface continued, there was nothing to worry about. It was possible to move forward, but not to lose vigilance, relying on each other. This was easy to do because each half of the team knew each other well. And during a short conversation, it turned out that Speed and Charlotte are actually related. This put many points into place. The unknown weapon in the hands of comrades no longer raised questions. At the same time, the guy's affection for this impudent girl became completely justified. Russell greeted this news with silence, unaware of how much he had missed. But now he himself came into the field of vision of these guys and began to admire their respect. Speed sincerely believed that his comrade would soon become an outstanding hero. Chloe also supported this idea and wanted all the best for her beloved. Only Ashley silently listened to the minions' conversation, as if it wasn't interesting at all. She even quickened her steps to get a little further away from the group. While at the head of the bed, the others were making guesses about this. The reason for this behavior was simple. She hated heroes and everything connected with them. This reaction to things that most people adored seemed strange. In the midst of the dialogue, Russell suddenly saw several giant scratches on the wall. This could have been left by a large monster, but it certainly wasn't a buffalo. It was necessary to speed up and complete the mission to avoid even more trouble. None of the comrades noticed the few pebbles emitting dark magical energy on the ground. It was the work of that same bodyguard who was now talking to his superior. He assured that the instructor did not need to worry about anything. Therefore, besides this, there were many more surprises waiting for the students downstairs. Kimberly, who hated failure, was now doubting the promises. There were no guarantees. After listening to the full report, the woman no longer saw the point of hanging on the phone. She was waiting for the result. The guard looked back at the gate. He was sure that he had done everything correctly. The closed gates emanated concentrated dark energy. This was evidence that the same forbidden door was open in the center of the dungeon. The only thing that worried the man was Russell, who seemed to know that a trap was waiting inside the group. Therefore, to be on the safe side and avoid trouble, the security guard decided to personally check the result. For some time, the team moved through the tunnels without any adventures. But soon, Chloe felt the monsters approaching from behind. It was a very large number of enemies, about 50. Such a herd could simply trample the students. It was necessary to take some measures to protect each other. All talk about there being few monsters inside today was forgotten when this cluster became visible. And indeed, it was a very large gang, which rushed towards them very quickly. It seemed as if they were not buffaloes at all, but rather acted like a gigantic, solid organism. But the roar of the creatures put everything in its place. The only difference from the previous ones were the red eyes, glowing with madness. Now the situation seemed much more serious, and there could be no talk of an easy confrontation. Russell was frantically trying to come up with a plan. All he had to do was choose the right knife, as his teacher had once said. While studying all these wisdoms, Wesley then got his ass kicked many times. And now, the memories of the different types of kitchen knives came back to me all at once. In these circumstances, he would have to violate the science of the stern sensei. Except for the fish knife, there was nothing. Having visualized the fight, the guy began to give orders. He decided to attack from the side. Chloe had to keep an eye on the formation to make sure none of the opponents would hit them unexpectedly. This time, Speed didn't have to explain anything. The young man had already begun to synchronize with the squad leader. This was not their first serious battle. Only Ashley didn't understand what was happening. But the next moment the order found her too, there was no time for talking. The buffalo were ordered to kill on sight if they got too close. This time, plans for a horn collection had to be put on hold because lives were at stake. Russell almost meditatively reached into his bag to select a weapon. The guy decided to get several knives at once. The problem needed to be solved radically. The hero activated the blessing as one of the buffaloes rushed forward, identifying him as the enemy. Taking good aim, the young man launched the artifacts towards his opponent, who didn't even think of dodging. It was such a fascinating spectacle that Ashley momentarily forgot about her duties. Everyone except her reacted in the usual way, so this wasn't the first time. She even dropped her favorite chocolate bar from her hands when she saw Russell win. The picture was incredible. The guy stood on the back of the buffalo, surrounded by a powerful aura of rage, It seemed like he didn't even tense up. The fight as a whole lasted less than a second. Chloe, having waited for the right moment, also became active. The girl was already expecting her victories. 3 buffaloes opened their stinking mouths, preparing to tear their prey with their teeth. With the help of Schrodinger's cat skill, the girl was able to change her position in an instant. This left the opponents unclear as to where exactly to expect the strike. It was all over after a few sessions, and this time, without outside help. Russell, meanwhile, was not standing still either. He literally flew over the heads of the creatures, attacking them from the air. His knives flew without touching the ground, cutting through the weeds like butter. These moving targets did not seem dangerous to him at all, until one of the buffaloes, taken by surprise, appeared out of nowhere, cutting off his path. It was really unexpected and risky. Ashley and Speed watched the proceedings with tension. The second freak joined the first one. They attacked the guy from different sides, holding him in place. Eventually, after a few seconds, too many enemies had gathered around Russell. They formed a kind of dome, under which the student was buried. Ashley decided to act. She pulled the bowstring, confident that the leader would not be able to cope with the invasion. But, in just a moment, there was no trace left of the monsters. Russell was still completely unharmed. The girl forgot how to breathe from what she saw. She had never seen anything like this in her life. Without exaggeration, this special student of the Joaquin Academy was the best warrior of our time. The dangerous herd was dealt with faster than the boy expected. And the catch turned out to be quite good. A whole bag of horns became Russell's reward, which should be enough to improve the sword. He thanked the increased time of the painlessness blessing, and little by little the pain lessened its effect on him. Despite this personal success, Chloe was the most joyful of the team members. She was happy not for herself but for the guy, although she herself put in a lot of effort to win. Their pleasantries with each other again took up quite a bit of time. Speed, meanwhile, tried to satisfy the silent questions in Ashley's eyes. He reminded his friend that he had already spoken about the extraordinary power of the group's leader. She should believe it. But now, logical arguments were irrelevant. The archer admitted that she was in a state of shock. Now the girl has a goal: to find out the real identity of the special student. Speed couldn't help him with this, although he himself had made all sorts of assumptions more than once. For the healer, only one thing became obvious. A real hero was now standing in front of him, a legendary figure whose activities they were all fortunate to witness. The expedition decided to move deeper into the dungeon. By Speed's count, they had already met the quota to complete the mission. To be fair, Russell contributed more than 20 of the required individuals on his own. If it weren't for the unsettled work of the students from the Dragon class, the team would have perished long ago. While chatting, the students didn't notice how they reached the main door of the dungeon. They were indeed huge, but the chains that were supposed to hold the entity inside were flying around. This indicated that there was someone on the other side who wanted to be released. Meanwhile, the guard reached the place where a herd of buffalo infected with magic stones died. All his efforts were in vain. The students easily destroyed the ambush. The scoundrel couldn't back down because he had a large debt, and this part-time job solved the problems. Kimberly found him and settled the matter by making the guard responsible for her. With the help of a magic stone, a man must take control of all the monsters in the dungeon. The buffaloes had to be kept in this state until the arrival of a student named Russell, and to let him go after her would lead to the death of the group, which is what the woman was longing for. The stone door inside the dungeon also had to be open in case the squad survived. At first, the stranger's lack of principle struck the guard, but money was more important. He agreed to all the conditions and thus got stuck in this story. At that time, the scoundrel thought that the matter would be easy. But now everything has become unpredictably more complicated. He moved on, hoping that the dungeon boss would do its job by the time he got there. Since the chains did not hold the stone door, it could be assumed that someone had weakened it. This could have been done intentionally, and Russell understood this. The story with the dungeon looked suspicious from the very beginning. The gates could only be opened under the influence of the period's magic stone, so the ambush was obvious. It's time to think about what reward you can get for destroying the boss. The only problem the guy saw in this story was that he could no longer activate painlessness. This time he will have to fight despite the incredible pain. And Russell hoped that he would have time to do what was needed before the ugly woman finally woke up. But the opposite happened. The stone door was a diversion. In fact, the dungeon boss had already appeared behind them. The giant slammed his axe down on the floor, establishing his position. The frightened students stepped back, of course. None of them expected such a meeting. Russell only gritted his teeth harder. He remembered that the reward for defeating the boss was the transfer of the blessing. The giant monster was called a minotaur named Kaukin and was of power class A. And, as if to prove that life could be worse, a large buffalo appeared on the right side of the monster. Then another one was added from the left. Both creatures were larger than all the previous ones. The situation seemed to be at a standstill. There was nowhere to run. The boss's apostate bulls stepped forward, preparing for a forced march. Everyone except Russell was trying to recover from the initial shock. They had never seen the monster hiding behind the door, so the young man worked on a strategy on his own. Luckily, this trouble was different from the previous one, because in his past life he had passed through this dungeon. Therefore, he roughly understood the Minotaur's weaknesses and was confident that he could handle him himself. This will be the best way out of the situation, despite the fact that you will have to endure terrible pain. There was no more time to waste. The knife master took up arms. He asked the healer to focus on non-painful pains. Speed replied that he could only fulfill the request within 2 minutes. It was much longer than with painlessness activation, but under the condition of full concentration. When the guys finally understood each other, it was time to involve the girls. Russell said that he would take charge, and they would deal with the apostates. The guy wanted his girlfriends to focus on the principle of ranged combat. That is, he placed the main responsibility on Ashley. The roar of one of the buffaloes became the signal for the beginning of resistance. The freak demanded blood. The knife master decisively activated the sword god's blessing. At that very moment, unbearable pain pierced his entire body. A terrible pain was racking his insides and was felt in the smallest parts of his body. Blood started coming out of the guy's mouth. Speed. Weapon tried his best to fulfill his part of the deal in good faith. And thanks to these efforts, terrible tortures could be endured to the limit of one's capabilities. Russell had no options for retreat. The dungeon boss had chosen him as an opponent. The knife maker can only rely on the skill he has acquired over the years. He flew around his opponent, avoiding all blows from the giant axe. It hurt, but the young man tried not to think about it, because saving the lives of his comrades was more important. It was up to him whether they would leave here unharmed or remain in the dungeon forever. Even Kauken's punch to the body was not so painful against the background of constant sensations. At the same time, Russell felt an extraordinary freedom, which was also blocked by the skill of painlessness before. This feeling seemed to take him to a new level of speed and concentration. This also added to the increased intuition and strategic thinking. The guy could literally see the enemy's next movements and plot the trajectory of his own movements. The Minotaur could only become even more angry in his attempts to catch the impudent thief. With each passing second, Russell's maneuvering abilities only increased. While the monster was destroying everything around him, he was turning circles around her to exhaust her. It seemed like the knife master was actually avoiding the fight, but that was not the case. He waited for the right moment. At one critical moment, Kauken dropped his axe on the boy and he disappeared into the smoke. The freak stopped, waiting for the results of his actions and hoping that the fight was over. But the Minotaur's efforts were in vain. The guy remained completely unharmed. Not only the dungeon monsters were amazed by the hero's agility, Ashley couldn't believe her eyes. While dealing with her target, the girl tried to watch Russell almost every second. In the students' understanding, only the greatest warriors were able to use everything around them to their advantage. For the first time, her theoretical ideas and knowledge were transformed into a concrete image of a person. The theory suddenly became an axiom, which meant that absolute power really did exist. It wasn't that difficult to deal with the apostate buffalo. She was willing to help Chloe if needed, but the boss was the main concern here. The girl remembered rumors that Keith had to use his aura to protect himself from some student. In Ashley's mind, all the pieces of the puzzle came together to form a complete picture. In front of her was a man she needed to stick to. And just a moment later, something interesting happened in favor of this strategy. The Minotaur completely lost control and made a mistake. He tried to attack the young man with his fist. What was once called the end fell to the ground, bleeding. At the same time, the student remained unshakably calm, as if this were a bread campaign and not a serious battle. Speed mentally screamed with delight. The guy was delighted. He was helping such a master. Although it was not easy at all, he also felt some of the pain that was being healed while everyone was struggling. Chloe also managed to kill her buffalo. It didn't take long. Although it could not be said that the matter was easy, the lack of experience was evident. She had been told since childhood that the most dangerous monsters were those that were closest to human form, so she could imagine how difficult the battle with Kauken was. Meanwhile, the freak, enraged by the loss of full functionality of his hand, roared with rage. Unfortunately, the Minotaur was ambidextrous, so he easily intercepted the axe for the other end. By lifting it up, the monster thus made a statement about continuing the fight. In addition, real magic was now seeping through the artifact, and this was strange and suspicious. This led the students to think about the obvious help of dark forces. The freak got involved with his weapon at the cost of his own life, and from that moment on, the magical aura around him became almost impenetrable. Of course, the team wanted to help the leader, despite the risks to themselves. They firmly believed in his power. Kauken completed his transformation and was ready for the final battle. Russell was barely holding on, exhausted by constant pain, and when the axe began to descend over him, the guy seemed to have once again entered some kind of augmented reality. Instead of dodging, Russell actually leaned forward. The young man tried to keep up with his opponent, although it was too difficult. He held his ground, trying to come up with a plan of action, even if it meant harming himself. The knife master felt that he could not break through the monster's defense, but he could not retreat either. This would mean that he was abandoning his comrades to certain death in a matter of seconds. This solution to the problem was unacceptable. The entire squad had to emerge unharmed from this dungeon. Ashley did not understand the reasons for the team leader's inaction. She believed that he was wasting precious time. But Russell himself had no time for this. He didn't care about the opinions of others. With his mind completely focused on his goal, the boy suddenly saw a clear solution to the problem. It was as if the system itself was telling him where to hit in order to destroy the giant monster. The young man's blade slowly cut through the magical matter. And although the process was slow, progress was still significant. Chloe remembered seeing this blue aura around Russell. This is what the full power of his blessing looked like. Kaken, in his rage, had no intention of retreating, despite the clear and obvious threat to his life. And that is why the battle ended in his complete defeat. The knife blade cut the monster in half and its remains fell to the ground. Thus ended the conquest of the dungeon. It was an absolute victory. The team members watched the fascinating spectacle in silence. Russell tried to stay on his feet and finally catch his breath. Now, perhaps, she could relax, because the excruciating pain seemed to have dried her up to the last drop. The young man had never experienced such fatigue since his stay in this world. The battle against the dungeon boss lasted more than 2 minutes. But despite this, the healer did not betray his comrades' expectations. Speed was more worried about Russell than himself, even though he was injured too. The boy thanked all the gods for allowing him to become an assistant to such a talented master. The young man's thoughts were interrupted by Ashley's appearance nearby. The girl decided to talk. She admitted that she had been making the wrong assumptions about the team leader all along. From that moment on, the archer readily admitted that before her stood a true legendary figure. She finally understood and put into perspective all the strange aspects of the relationships in the squad. Ashley even assumed that after this, Russell could be transferred to the second year right now. The rules of the academy did not prohibit such transfers, and extraordinary talent could not be hidden. Moreover, the archer would like to study in the same class with the knife master starting tomorrow. The student, meanwhile, hoped that after this battle they would no longer face danger. Exhausted, he fell to the ground and Chloe immediately ran to him. The guy was conscious. He was just incredibly tired. Even after Murasami was back in the vaginas, Russell was still in pain. Meanwhile, the system has already rolled out an announcement about a grand reward. According to the script, Bruce is supposed to receive this blessing one day, along with an extraordinary level of development. The blessing of transmission was now in the possession of the knife master, completely changing the course of history. This news threatened the timing of the start of the Great War. And while Russell was thinking about how to avoid this, the guard reached the main hall of the dungeon. Since the guy himself no longer had any strength left, he asked Chloe to arrange everything as best as possible. The villain didn't even notice that he was trapped. The girl kicked the man into the ground. He had no chance of escape. The sword protruding from his thigh indicated that the spy was now a prisoner. Thus began the interrogation. Only Ashley and Speed have not yet fully understood the complexity of the situation. At first, the security guard began to pretend that he did not understand this attitude towards him at all. But this did not impress Russell. He was eager to find out the truth. Within a minute, the archer realized that the spy wanted them dead. The reasons remained unclear, but it was easily fixed. It is obvious that someone was guiding this scoundrel, promising him a reward for the murder. But the security guard was in no hurry to answer questions about the customer. And this encouraged students to use torture. There was no point in talking about humanity at that moment. Such threats had their effect. The man's tongue loosened and he told the whole truth. Information about the academy instructor and debts angered the boys. The guard immediately began to justify his choice, but no one cared. The comrades had already concentrated on the personality of the instructor from the Joaquin Academy. The spy described the woman in sufficient detail to allow identification. Ashley was the first to guess that it might be the assistant to the head instructor, Kimberly. During the exchange of opinions, the girl learned that this was not the first trap. There was no longer any point in hiding the truth, because the archer had become part of the conspiracy. That's why Speed honestly said that the destruction of the mermaid was the work of Russell, and not Bruce or anyone else. Once all the circumstances of the hidden betrayal at the academy were revealed, the interrogation could be completed. To be on the safe side, the knife master recorded everything on a dictaphone. Decisive measures had to be taken to prevent the information from leaking. Chloe pulled the sword from the captive's thigh. The death of this man in a dungeon with open gates would not have looked strange. So, on Russell's orders, the girl went on her first contract killing without hesitation. The matter was decided within a few seconds. Chloe even delivered the blows in such a way that suspicion would fall on the monsters if any remains were found. The knife master decided that from that moment on, he would no longer deviate from his path. After leaving the dungeon, the guy immediately went to the blacksmith's workshop. He placed a corner of the Minotaur on his desk, saying that he wanted to improve his weapon. There was silence in the forge. The master did not know how to react to what he saw. The man expected anything but body parts of a Class A monster. This is my testimony that the guy was able to cope with the monster on his own. Even if it happened on a team, it was an impressive achievement for freshmen. The only thing that upset the blacksmith was the state of Murasame, which he had worked so fruitfully on. But the indignation quickly died down under the heavy gaze of the customer. The master began to justify his overly harsh reaction in order to avoid getting a spanking. Pleased that his interlocutor had backed off, Russell headed for the exit. He did not consider it necessary to justify himself to the man who had screwed up his job. Their agreement was kept. The guy only had to wait for the order to be completed. In order not to seem unbearable, the young man allowed the blacksmith to spend the remaining materials as he wished. On this note, the customer and the contractor said goodbye. The next morning, the boy already attended a lecture at the academy. Although the recovery was not complete, Russell felt much better. He didn't want to go to the infirmary, so he hoped for Viplin's help. Due to the destruction of monsters in the dungeon, several indicators in his parameters have increased significantly. This meant that he was on the right path to strengthen his immunity from the blessing of the sword god. Outwardly, apart from the gray hair, nothing showed any changes. The only thing he was worried about was the possibility of going bald. Thoughts about the future inspired worries about unexpected death. But the young man could not allow himself to become discouraged. He still had to deal with the new blessing. But no matter how Russell looked ahead, the immediate problem remained healing. Whatever anyone says, the Knife Master still managed to assemble his first team. People depended on him, and he did not let them down in difficult times. The thoughts were interrupted, as always, by the swift and loud appearance of the chief instructor. Keith Nibelung entered the auditorium with him. The hero's despair knew no bounds. He was tired of the endless persecution of the strongest man in the world. He was distracted, literally, for a moment, because of a strange SMS from an unknown number. When he looked away from the phone screen, he was even more shocked. It turned out that Ashley was writing to him. The girl, smiling, dropped in to see the Dragons class. Meanwhile, the instructor, without further ado, announced important news. The archer would be studying here. He demanded respect for the girl and help in adapting. Surprised, the young men all rose from their seats as one. They could not take their eyes off the beauty. Nobody paid attention to the fact that training was supposed to start in half an hour. Russell knew the new girl was heading straight for him. Ashley was one of a generation of miracles, people who occupied the top 4 spots in the academy. She was the daughter of the Prime Minister of Japan and a very intelligent heroine. That's why her decision to change her star class to dragon class seemed strange to everyone. It was no longer possible to change anything. It seemed that the archer had made her final decision. Her goal was Russell, and she was going to be around him and learn from him, even if he didn't want it. Nobody asked his opinion. The guy was completely amazed by the behavior of the local girls. He was ready to run away from this world rather than be near these stalkers. By evening, the police had already cordoned off the crime scene and everything around the dungeon. They were questioning witnesses about the disappearance of one of the guards. They had nothing to hide because they didn't really understand what had happened. The men remembered only one thing. Their colleague was very excited. He decided to check the situation in the dungeons, so he went down there himself. When the series of interrogations was completed, the detectives wearily went out for a smoke break. They shared their versions of the potential crime, and below was a depressing picture. The large number of monsters in the tunnels have already begun to stink. There were almost 100 of them, which was an astonishing number for ordinary first-year students. According to the visitor log, these young men and women were the last to enter the dungeon. They made it out unharmed, but the same could not be said for the missing guard. Detectives had no idea where the man had gone, but they assumed he might have remained outside the main gate. If so, he would remain missing. It was necessary to discuss what happened with the freshmen. It was quite a complicated matter that needed some careful work. According to the dialogue, the law enforcement officers did not even notice the enemy approaching, until one of them fell victim to a magic spell. Ordinary people didn't have a chance to resist powerful magic. And Kimberly knew it very well. The woman was intoxicated with her power. She finished off the second detective a moment later. The scoundrels didn't need any extra witnesses. It's time to find out what really happened to the clueless spy and assess Russell's power. It could also be that this special student was the main hero of the human race. The next day, Ashley continued to sit next to her new friend as if nothing had happened. All she did was eat her favorite sweets. Meanwhile, Russell already wanted to get rid of the intrusive neighbor. He even hinted that he was used to sitting next to Chloe during lectures. But it didn't have the effect the young man had hoped for. Ashley didn't give a damn about the customs and traditions that came before her. The strange behavior of the interlocutor gave rise to many questions in the Knife Master's head. He became interested in why she transferred from a prestigious class, but the hero did not have time to get an answer. The head instructor was planning to train outdoors again, so it was time to get ready. Unlike the others, Ashley had no intention of going anywhere. She was getting ready to take a nap. Within a few seconds, her carefree snoring began to sound from under the mask. Russell had the thought that he was jealous of the archers. She was free to do what she wanted. Meanwhile, in Star's class, Charlotte came up with a new way to provoke Annabelle. She started spreading gossip about Ashley and the special student. At first, the gossip girl's interlocutor hardly reacted to the news. The blonde didn't mean to appear so simple. She said that the archer was lucky because Russell's class was short-staffed. And most likely, Annabelle should be worried about Ashley's closeness to the special student. The latest news was that they were both members of a group that conquered one of the dungeons. According to Charlotte, passionate feelings could have arisen between the boy and the girl during this time. Gradually, the things her friend said began to really irritate Annabelle. She didn't like it when the blonde talked about her sympathy for Russell, although she often thought about him. Keith Nibelung's granddaughter could not admit these strange feelings even to herself. Now she wanted to dot all the I's and cross all the T's. She and the special student had almost no lines of intersection. The beauty did not want her name to be associated with any dubious romances. But Charlotte could not be stopped. She clearly saw what her interlocutor did not acknowledge. She wanted fair competition so that no one would accuse her of deceit later. Therefore, from the blonde's point of view, her friend needed to think about these words and listen to her heart. Now Annabelle's mind was occupied with her grandfather, who had unexpectedly decided to become an instructor. It compromised all the efforts she had put into building her own reputation all along. More shocking news was that Kat didn't want to train the Star class. Grandfather aspired to become a mentor in the Dragon class, the one where Russell studied. He assured that his granddaughter had nothing to worry about. No one would connect them with each other. Despite these words, Annabelle had a different opinion. This situation looked too tricky. The girl began to feel that the strongest man in the world had chosen his viceroy in the person of the Knife Master. Of course, he was interested in such a talented figure that appeared out of nowhere. During his time at the academy, Annabelle's main rival has really changed a lot. Even Bruce, once considered a prime candidate for heroism, was now inferior to the boy in strength. At the same time, the representative of the strongest clan could not hate a guy with such a sincere heart. But envy took its toll. She was oppressed by her grandfather's many years of neglect, in contrast to such efforts for others. Charlotte's next sly hints finally forced the girl to explode. She jumped up from her chair and started yelling at the entire audience. Annabelle assured that she had no feelings for the guy. This time, my friend's reaction was very different from the previous ones. She seemed to finally take these words seriously and was glad to have lost her competitors. The lecture on the basics of blessing turned out to be quite interesting. The teacher explained that this gift was passed down from the being who gave it to him. This applied to all species. Despite the interesting discussion, Ashley continued to sleep. Russell had already begun to acquire this amazing ability. This girl could only be woken up by a chocolate bar. On the other hand, it seemed to the guy that she was pretending to be asleep just so as not to have to explain her transition. It was already Chloe's reaction when she saw a competitor in this audience. Fortunately, the girl was still in the hospital. Unexpectedly, the conversation turned to the blessing of the spirit. This was exactly the kind that the young man received for completing the dungeon. According to the teacher, such power was very rare, so critically little information was known about her. Most rarely, it was only the hero's blessing. The only person to receive it was Joaquin Valor, the same one who founded the academy. Here and there, one could find another opinion. Given the modern times, another person possessed this power. At the end of the lecture, Russell could not resist and decided to ask a question that had been bothering him for several days. Every time before using the sword god's blessing, he saw the same phrase in front of his eyes. He became curious about what these words meant. When he said the sentence out loud, even Ashley woke up from her lethargy. It turned out that the teacher didn't understand what was being discussed. But the man kindly agreed to study this issue together outside of class time. When the lecture was over, the guy had 15 minutes for a restorative nap, and he happily followed his neighbor's example. Almost instantly after he closed his eyes, the young man found himself in an unknown place. He was finally brought to his senses by a system notification about a request for communication. Gradually, the chaos began to transform into something more definite. It was a large display. The guy himself levitated in space among the remaining mechanisms. He was required to respond to a request to communicate with the Game Master. An interesting twist.